Hey my friend, welcome back. Or if this is your very first time here, hello, and I'm so glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet where we slow everything down and let history carry you somewhere peaceful tonight. Get comfortable. Wherever you are right now, stretched out on your couch, tucked into bed, maybe sitting in a quiet room while the rest of the world is still buzzing, this story is for you. Before there were kings, before there were borders or armies or laws or the idea of countries at all, there were the mountains. And the mountains had gates. Not gates made of iron or stone, nothing that human hands had built. These were gates carved by glaciers over millions of years. Narrow corridors of rock and ice threading their way through some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. And here is the thing that nobody really tells you in the history books. It was not the emperors who decided the fate of civilizations. It was not the generals or the philosophers or the merchants with the heaviest purses. It was these gaps in the mountains. These quiet, windswept saddles of rock sitting at 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 feet above sea level, where the air was thin, the snow never fully melted, and the path forward was no wider than a country road. Whoever controlled those gaps controlled the world, and the people who dared to cross them, they paid a price that most of us today cannot even begin to imagine. Now, before we step into that world together, I want to take just a moment. If you enjoy waking up to stories like this one, the kind that make history feel like something you lived, rather than something you studied, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and left a like on this video. And I genuinely love hearing from you in the comments. Tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? Are you in bed with the lights already off, or are you still on the couch debating whether to move, drop it down below? I read more of those than you might think. Now go ahead and dim the lights if you can. Maybe let a fan run softly in the background. Let the noise of the day fall away. And let us walk together through the mountain passes of history, the gateways that ruled the world. Alright, let us start at the very beginning. Or rather, let us start with a question that I find myself coming back to again and again. Why do we think of mountains as walls? Because for most of human history, that is exactly what they were. Enormous, indifferent walls. The Alps stretch across south-central Europe for roughly 750 miles. The Himalayas run for nearly 1,500 miles across Asia. The Hindu Kush forms a barrier between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent that is in places nearly 5 miles high. And for most of the people living on either side of these ranges, the mountains were simply the edge of the world. The place where the familiar stopped and the unknown began. You did not cross them because you wanted to. You crossed them because you had no other choice. But here is the thing about walls. Every wall has a crack. And the mountain passes were those cracks. The geological word for them is a col, from the Latin word for neck. And that image is perfect, actually. A mountain pass is like the narrow neck of a bottle. Everything that wants to flow from one side to the other has to squeeze through that one tight point. Armies, trade caravans, pilgrims, refugees, ideas, all of it funneled through those narrow corridors. And because of that, the passes became some of the most strategically important pieces of real estate in human history. Let us talk about a few of them, because I think once you hear their stories, you will never look at a mountain range the same way again. Start with the Brenner Pass. It sits at just 4,495 feet above sea level in the Alps, which makes it one of the lowest crossings of the entire mountain chain. That does not sound very impressive, until you realize that its neighbors are peaks rising to nearly 13,000 feet. The Brenner was essentially a gift, a geological accident that gave traders and travelers a manageable road through a landscape that would otherwise have been impassable. The Romans built roads over it. Merchants from Venice used it to reach the trading cities of Germany, and by the 14th century nearly 90% of all trade moving between Venice and Augsburg, two of the most important commercial cities in Europe at the time, passed through this one single point. 90%. Think about that. Every bolt of silk, every sack of pepper, every shipment of silver, all of it flowing through one narrow corridor in the Alps. A local merchant named Heinrich Künter understood this so clearly that in the year 1314 he actually petitioned his lord for the right to improve the road through the Eisack Gorge on the approach to the pass. He spent his own money, he organised his own labour, because he knew whoever made the road better would make a fortune. And he was right. Now move east, past the Alps, past the mountain ranges of Persia, all the way to the border of what is today Pakistan and Afghanistan. There, cutting through the Spingar Mountains, is the Khyber Pass. If the Brenner was a gift, the Khyber was a crown jewel. Barely 53 kilometres long, at its narrowest point just 3 metres wide. 3 metres. That is about the width of a single car lane. And through that impossibly narrow gap, an astonishing parade of history walked, marched, rode, and bled its way across the centuries. Darius I of Persia sent his armies through it in the 5th century before the Common Era. Alexander the Great followed, leading his forces into India in the 4th century before the Common Era. The Silk Road ran through it, carrying silk and jade and spices and ideas between China and Rome. The Mughals used it to build an empire. The British fought 3 separate wars trying to control it. At various points in its history, a single day's traffic through the Khyber Pass represented the movement of goods, people, and power that shaped the entire subcontinent. And the tribes who lived in and around that narrow corridor, the Afridi clans, the Shinwari, they understood its value better than anyone. For centuries they charged tolls, not out of greed exactly, but out of a very clear-eyed understanding that they lived at the most important intersection in Asia. You want to get through, you pay. It was in its way the oldest highway toll in history. And then there is the Great St. Bernard Pass. This one sits at 8,100 feet in the Swiss Alps, connecting what is now Switzerland to the Aosta Valley in Italy. It has been used since the Bronze Age. Julius Caesar wanted to control it. Augustus Caesar eventually did. And by the Middle Ages it had become one of the most heavily travelled routes in all of Europe, used by pilgrims heading to Rome, merchants carrying wool and spices, and envoys carrying messages between the courts of Europe. There is a story I want to come back to later in this series, a story involving this very pass, 1,000-year-old building still standing today, and some of the most extraordinary animals in the history of human rescue. But for now, just let that image settle in your mind, a narrow road winding up through the snow 8,000 feet above sea level, used continuously by human beings for more than 3,000 years. Now here is the part I find most fascinating, and I think you will too. These passes were not just physical routes, they were cultural highways. When the Khyber Pass was open, Buddhism travelled west from India into Central Asia. When the Brenner was thriving, Renaissance art and ideas poured north from Italy into Germany and beyond. When the Silk Road funneled through the mountain passes of Central Asia, Chinese silk and Roman glassware ended up in the same marketplace, carried by traders who had never met each other across distances that neither of them could fully imagine. The French historian Fernand Braudel, one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, described the Alps as, and I am paraphrasing here, an exceptional range of mountains remarkable for the quality of its human population and the number of good roads. What he meant was this: the mountains did not stop human civilization. They shaped it. Every pass was a lens focusing the energy of human movement into a single intense point, and wherever that energy focused, towns grew. Monasteries rose, toll gates went up, bandits gathered, and a whole ecosystem of people learned to live off the endless, unstoppable flow of travellers passing through. But here is the other side of that story, the side that the history books sometimes gloss over. These places were also profoundly dangerous. Not just dangerous the way a steep hiking trail is dangerous. Dangerous in a way that modern life has almost entirely erased from our experience. When a Spanish pilgrim named Pero Tafur crossed the St. Gothard Pass in the year 1437, he wrote about it afterward in a way that makes your stomach tighten. It was the end of August, what we would think of as a perfectly reasonable time to be in the mountains, and yet the snow was melting in the heat, he wrote, making the crossing extremely perilous. In August, the end of summer, and he considered himself lucky to have survived. That was the reality of mountain travel for most of human history. There was no weather forecast, no emergency helicopter waiting in a valley below, no Gore-Tex jacket keeping the cold out. You walked into the mountains with what you carried on your back, what your animals could pull, and what your own courage could sustain. And sometimes that was enough, and sometimes it was not. Here is something that I think puts all of this into perspective. In the year 2011, as glaciers in Norway began to melt back due to warming temperatures, archaeologists started finding things on a mountain pass called Lendbreen: shoes, pieces of rope, the remains of an ancient wooden ski, horseshoes, a broken walking stick with a runic inscription. And when they translated that inscription, it said something that I find almost unbearably moving. It said, "Owned by Jah." That is it. Just a name. Someone 1,000 years ago or more carved their name into a stick. Maybe they were proud of it. Maybe they were afraid of losing it. Maybe they just wanted to leave some small mark on the world before they stepped out into the cold and the wind and the unknown, and then they dropped it, or they fell, or the storm came faster than expected, and the ice preserved it for 1,000 years, and now we know their name. Yoar, a person who crossed a mountain pass, just like the thousands and thousands who crossed before and after them, each one carrying their life in their hands, each one betting everything on a narrow corridor through the sky. Over the next several parts of this journey, we're going to follow those people. We're going to look at who they were and why they went. We're going to open their packs and count what they carried. We're going to walk with them through the seasons, through the snow and the ice and the thin air. We're going to meet the monks who built shelters at the tops of the world to save strangers from dying. We're going to hear about the bandits who waited in the shadows of the cliffs. We're going to listen to the sound of 1,000 mule bells echoing off rock walls, and we're going to sit with the silence of a mountain morning when the only thing between a traveller and death was their own judgment, their own strength, and a little bit of luck. Because when you understand what it cost to cross these passes, not just in money or time, but in fear and exhaustion and genuine mortal risk, you start to see something remarkable. You start to see how much of the world we live in today was built on the courage of ordinary people doing an extraordinary thing, just crossing the mountain, just putting one foot in front of the other and keeping going. And speaking of keeping going, in the very next part of our journey, we're going to meet those travellers up close, not the emperors, not the generals, the regular people, the merchant with a load of wool and a prayer on his lips, the pilgrim who sold everything she owned to make this journey once in her lifetime, the young trader on his very first crossing trying not to let the others see how terrified he truly was. Who were they? Why did they go? And what did they believe was waiting for them on the other side? The answers might surprise you more than you expect. There is a question that has sat quietly in the back of my mind for as long as I have been reading about mountain travel in the ancient and medieval world. And the question is this: what kind of person looks at a mountain range, a wall of rock and ice and wind that rises nearly 2 miles above them, and thinks, yes, I will go over that. I will go through that. That is the reasonable choice. Because let me be honest with you, standing at the foot of the Alps or the Hindu Kush or the Pyrenees with no weather forecast, no Gore-Tex, no satellite phone, and no guarantee that the path ahead has not been buried under 6 feet of snow, since the last person tried it, the reasonable choice is to stay home. And yet century after century, thousands upon thousands of people did not stay home. They went. So who were they? That is what I want to sit with tonight. Let us start with the one I find most surprising. Not the merchants, not the soldiers, the pilgrims. And before you picture a quiet, grey-robed figure shuffling peacefully down a country road, I need you to understand what pilgrimage actually meant in the medieval world. It was not a vacation. It was not a spiritual retreat. In many cases, it was the hardest, most dangerous, most expensive thing an ordinary person would ever attempt in their entire life, and millions of them did it anyway. The major pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe fed directly into the mountain passes. The Via Francigena, one of the most travelled roads in the medieval world, began in Canterbury, England, wound through France and Switzerland, and poured pilgrims directly through the Alpine passes toward Rome. Nearly 2,000 miles, depending on where you started. 2,000 miles mostly on foot, covering 15 to 20 miles per day on a good day, with blistered feet, bad food, uncertain water, and absolutely no guarantee that you would make it back. Now pause on that for a second. 15 to 20 miles a day on foot through mountain terrain. Can I ask you something? When was the last time you walked more than 2 miles in a single day without complaining about it? Because these people were doing it for months. And the most remarkable thing is that they came from every layer of society. Not just the wealthy, not just the noble. History has this tendency to remember the famous pilgrims, the kings, the queens, the bishops making grand processions. But the majority of the people crossing those mountain passes on religious journeys were farmers, craftsmen, weavers and bakers and blacksmiths and market traders. Ordinary people who had spent years, sometimes their entire adult lives, saving enough money to make this one journey. Some of them sold their homes. Some of them left behind children, farms, businesses, everything they had built. Because the journey itself was the point. The suffering was the point. Crossing the mountain in wind and cold and exhaustion was not a problem to be solved. It was a form of prayer. There is a woman whose story I keep coming back to. Her name was Marjorie Kemp. She was born around the year 1373 in a small town on the eastern coast of England called Bishop's Lynn. Her father was a merchant and a mayor of a respectable family. She married at 20. She had 14 children. 14. And then somewhere in the middle of all of that, the household, the children, a couple of failed business ventures, something shifted in her. She described it as a calling. A conviction that she had to travel, that she had to go to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And so in the year 1414, when she was around 40 years old, with her husband still alive and her children still needing her, she made a deal with her husband. She would pay off his debts, he would let her go. And she went. Across England, through Europe, over the Alps, down to Venice, where she waited 13 weeks for a ship, across the Mediterranean to the port city of Jaffa, and then 50 miles by donkey to Jerusalem. The total journey was roughly 1,200 miles just to reach her destination. And then she turned around and came back. She did not do this once. She did this 3 times. The last time she was 60 years old and partially lame. And here is what strikes me most about Marjorie Kemp. She was not a saint. She was not a scholar. She was by many accounts deeply difficult to travel with. She wept constantly. She talked about God incessantly. She was at various points abandoned by her travelling companions, arrested for heresy, and left nearly penniless in Rome. But she went. She kept going. Because the mountain, the physical, terrifying, exhausting mountain, was for her a kind of doorway. Not an obstacle, a passage. Now pilgrims were only one thread in the tapestry of people crossing these passes. Let us talk about the merchants, because if the pilgrims crossed the mountains for their souls, the merchants crossed them for something far more earthly, and I say that without judgment because honestly I respect it enormously. Trade in the medieval world was not the clean, air-conditioned, next-day delivery system we live with now. A merchant carrying a load of Flemish wool from northern Europe to the markets of northern Italy, or a load of Venetian silk back in the other direction, was staking his life on a calculation. He was betting that the profit at the other end of the pass would be worth the cost of the crossing. And the costs were staggering. There were tolls at the foot of the pass, tolls at the top, tolls at bridges along the way. Local lords demanded payment for the right to use the road. Mule handlers charged by the load and by the day. Guidesmen who knew the mountain passes well enough to navigate them in poor visibility could charge whatever the market would bear, and in the winter months the market bore quite a lot. And underneath all of this sat one very quiet, very real danger that rarely appears in the romantic accounts of medieval trade, the possibility that you simply would not make it, that a spring storm would roll in faster than expected, that a mule would slip on an ice-slicked path and take your entire season's inventory down the cliff with it, that the toll-keepers at the top would decide that today they wanted everything you had, not just your coin, everything. The records are full of merchants who vanished in the passes, not captured, not robbed, just gone, swallowed by the mountain. And then there were the ambassadors, the messengers, the envoys, the people who crossed mountain passes not because they wanted to, but because a king had sent them and saying no was not an option. In the medieval world, the speed of communication was the speed of a horse or a man on foot. If the Pope in Rome needed to send a message to the court of France, someone had to physically carry it over the Alps. If a king needed to negotiate a treaty, someone had to travel in person. These were not ordinary travellers. These were professionals, trained riders who could cover enormous distances in short times, sleeping in shifts, changing horses at posting stations, pushing through weather that common travellers would have simply stopped and waited out. And still, even for them, the mountain passes were the great equalizer. No amount of royal authority made the snow melt faster. No diplomatic credential convinced an avalanche to hold off for one more day. At the top of the pass, everyone was just a person in the cold. But here is the category that fascinates me most of all. The ones who crossed the mountain not because of faith or profit or duty, but because they were running. Think about the medieval world for a moment. It was a world where justice could move very quickly in the wrong direction, where a political shift could turn a loyal servant into a wanted fugitive overnight, where a religious accusation, heresy, witchcraft, any number of charges that were easy to make and nearly impossible to defend against, could mean not just prison, but death. In those moments, the mountain pass was not a trade route. It was an escape hatch. Between the year 889 and 973, nearly a century, a group of Muslim raiders operating from a base on the southern coast of France actually blocked several alpine passes, entirely cutting off Christian travel between northern and southern Europe for generations. Think about that from the other direction. There were people on the northern side of those mountains who desperately needed to get south and could not, and there were people on the southern side who needed to go north and had to find another way. The mountain pass as an escape route, as a border, as a wall, it was all of these things simultaneously. And the people brave enough or desperate enough or clever enough to cross it anyway became some of the most fascinating characters in this entire story. There is something I want to share with you, a detail I came across in historical accounts that I genuinely could not stop thinking about. Medieval pilgrims did not just wake up one morning and decide to leave. In many communities, the departure of a pilgrim was a public event. The entire village would gather. There would be a blessing, a formal farewell, gifts of food for the road, and then, As the pilgrim walked away from everything familiar, the community would watch until they disappeared from view. Because everyone understood quietly without anyone saying it aloud that this might be the last time. Not certainly, but possibly. The mountain was out there. The road was long. The world was dangerous. And the pilgrim carrying their pack over their shoulder, turning one last time to wave at the people they loved. That image, I think, tells you more about the human relationship with mountain travel than any set of facts or statistics ever could. It was not bravery exactly, or rather it was bravery mixed with terror, mixed with faith, mixed with something else. A kind of stubborn, quiet insistence on going anyway, on deciding that whatever was on the other side of the mountain was worth the mountain itself. And I think that impulse, that decision, is actually one of the most human things there is. We all have mountains, don't we? Not the literal kind, necessarily, but the things that loom in front of us and say, this will be hard, this will cost you something, you might not make it, and we either turn back or we go. Now here is what I find remarkable. All of these people, the pilgrims, the merchants, the envoys, the fugitives, they did not cross the mountain alone. They could not. The mountain passes were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too ruthless for any individual to survive without help. And so they developed something extraordinary. Systems of preparation, rituals of packing, unwritten laws about what you carried and what you left behind, and the calculations they made, the brutal life-or-death arithmetic of what goes into a pack when the stakes are everything that is a story all on its own. Because you might be surprised to learn just how much and how little a medieval traveller brought with them into the high passes. What they chose to carry says everything about what they valued, and what they chose to leave behind says everything about what they feared. Picture this. You're standing in your home, or what serves as home in the year 1240, a small stone house on the edge of a market town in central France. The fire is still going, your family is awake, and on the floor in front of you is everything you plan to carry over the Alps. You've been thinking about this list for months. You've asked everyone you know who has made the crossing before. You have listened to the stories, some of them hopeful, some of them not. And now it all comes down to this moment. What goes in the bag, what stays behind? Because here is the truth that nobody in the modern world has to reckon with. The way those travellers did, the weight on your back is not just a matter of comfort. It is a matter of survival. Too little, and you run out of food before you reach the other side. Too much, and you cannot keep pace. You fall behind the group. And the mountain does not wait for stragglers. Let me walk you through it. Actually, let me back up even further, because the first question is not what to pack. The first question is what kind of body you're going to carry all of it with. And the answer for most medieval travellers crossing mountain passes was a body that had already been walking for weeks. Think about that for a second. For the vast majority of people making the crossing of the Alps, the pilgrims, the traders on foot, the messengers, the Alpine Pass was not the beginning of the journey. It was not even the middle. It was the terrifying, unavoidable obstacle that appeared somewhere in the long arc of a trip that might already have covered 400 or 500 miles on foot. By the time a pilgrim from northern France or England reached the foot of the Alps, they had already been on the road for weeks. Their feet were already blistered. Their shoes were already wearing thin, their food reserves were already lower than they started, and now the mountain stood in front of them. So what did they actually carry? The core kit of a medieval mountain traveller is something historians have been able to reconstruct with remarkable precision, partly from written accounts, partly from the incredible archaeological record that has been slowly melting out of the glaciers and ice patches of the Alps over the past few decades. And what it tells us is both fascinating and honestly a little heartbreaking, starting with clothing. Because clothing for a medieval traveller was not a matter of fashion, it was engineering. The base layer was linen, a long-sleeved shirt that sat against the skin. Over that came wool, usually a knee-length tunic belted at the waist, then more wool, a longer overcoat or a cotte depending on the era and the region, and over everything the cloak. The cloak was everything. It was your raincoat and your sleeping bag and your wind barrier all in one. A well-made woolen cloak, lanolin rich and tightly woven, was genuinely waterproof for a reasonable amount of time. It could be wrapped around yourself in the night, folded under your head as a pillow, pulled tight against the wind at the summit of the pass. A traveller who lost their cloak in the mountains was in serious trouble. A traveller who kept their cloak dry was a traveller with a fighting chance. On top of all of this came a broad-brimmed hat essential for keeping rain off the face and snow out of the eyes, woolen leggings wrapped around the lower legs for extra warmth, and shoes. Ah, the shoes. This is where I always pause, because the footwear situation for medieval mountain travellers is something that makes me genuinely uncomfortable to contemplate. These were leather shoes. Sturdy ones, yes, reinforced soles carefully stitched. But leather shoes, against the ice and snow and wet rock of an alpine pass. There were no crampons, no rubber soles, no ankle support in the modern sense, just leather laced tight, and a hope that the path ahead was not too icy. Now on top of clothing you needed food. And this is where the packing calculation gets genuinely fascinating. The first rule of travelling food in the medieval world was nothing that rots. You could not carry fresh meat over a mountain pass and expect it to still be edible by the time you reached the other side. So what you carried instead was a carefully curated selection of preserved calorie-dense foods. Hard bread, dense, dry, chewy, nearly indestructible. Salted and smoked meat strips of it wrapped and packed tight. Dried fish. Cheese, hard-aged cheese that could survive weeks in a pack without spoiling. Dried fruits, apples, figs, raisins. Honey oat cakes. Nuts. In better provisioned parties, spices not for flavour in the modern sense, but because spices were also used as medicine, as preservatives and as a kind of trade currency if you ran short of coins somewhere along the way. The records from Merton College in Oxford, which tracked the expenses of their representatives travelling through England in the 1300s and 1400s, mention travellers buying almonds, rice, sugar and ginger along the route, not because they were treating themselves, because these were practical items that had real value on the road. But here is the thing that I find most interesting about the food calculation specifically. A person crossing a mountain pass working hard, breathing thin air, burning calories at a rate far above normal, needed roughly 3 pounds of food a day to function well. 3 pounds. Now multiply that by the number of days the crossing might take. A favourable crossing of the Great St. Bernard Pass might take 3 days from the last town on the Italian side to the first settlement on the Swiss side. An unfavourable one, bad weather, wrong season, an injury might take 6, 8, more. So a traveller needed to carry somewhere between 9 and 24 pounds of food alone, just to the mountain section, not counting what they needed before and after, not counting the weight of their clothing, which could easily add another 10 to 15 pounds when wet, not counting their tools, their coin purse, their documents, their religious objects, not counting the small knife that every traveller carried, because a small knife was as essential as shoes. You used it to eat, to cut rope, to defend yourself in a pinch. It was not a weapon exactly, it was just a tool. Like everything else you carried, everything had a reason. There was no room for sentiment, unless you were a pilgrim. And here I want to make a distinction because it matters. The secular traveller, the merchant, the diplomat, the messenger packed with pure pragmatism. Every item justified by function, every ounce accounted for. But the pilgrim carried something extra. Always. A small religious text, a collection of prayers, some kind of holy object, a relic, a blessed medal, a small carved image of a saint. These things weighed almost nothing in a physical sense, but they weighed everything in the world that actually mattered to the person carrying them. Because when you were 3,000 feet above the tree line in the middle of a storm with the path ahead invisible, and the cold working its way through every layer you owned, a prayer was not a comfort. It was a strategy. It was the only thing between you and despair, and for people who genuinely believed that a saint could intercede on their behalf, that a blessed object could turn the weather, that God was watching, even on this God-forsaken ridge in the ice carrying those objects, was not irrational. It was the most practical thing they owned. Now, if you were travelling with a mule, and wealthier travellers certainly did, the arithmetic shifted considerably. A pack mule in good condition could carry roughly 130 kilograms on flat ground. On the steep, uneven, icy paths of an alpine crossing, experienced handlers aimed for far less. Perhaps 80 kilograms, sometimes less. Because a mule that slipped under a heavy load on a narrow mountain path was not just a tragedy, it was a catastrophe. The bones of pack mules have been found in the ice of Alpine passes and in the Norwegian mountain crossings. Real bones, real animals that died mid-crossing, and in some of those finds you can see exactly what happened. The mule slipped, or the load shifted, or the animal simply gave out exhausted at altitude in the cold, and the travellers had to make a terrible choice in that moment. Transfer what they could carry themselves, leave the rest, and keep going. Because stopping was not an option. The mountain does not pause for grief. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the packing. Something I have thought about for a long time, and I am not sure I have fully resolved it. When you strip away everything that is not essential, everything that is weight without function, what you are left with is a very clear portrait of what a person truly values. The food that keeps them alive, the clothing that keeps them warm, the tools that keep them moving, and then tucked in beneath all of that, the one small thing that has no practical use at all. The prayer book, the carved saint, the letter from home, the lock of a child's hair. I have read accounts of medieval travellers who, when forced to choose between their food and their devotional objects, chose the devotional objects. Rationally, that is a terrible decision. Practically speaking, you can pray without a prayer book. You cannot walk without food, but there is something deeply recognizably human about that choice. Something that tells you these people were not just travellers. They were people, with fears and loves and things they refused to leave behind, even when everything practical said they should. I wonder sometimes, and I think this is worth sitting with tonight, what would be in your pack if you had to strip everything down to what you truly needed, and then allow yourself just one thing that served no practical purpose at all. What would it be? What would you refuse to leave behind? Those are the kinds of questions that the mountain passes tend to surface. Not just about survival, about what we value when survival is all there is. And the people who made it through, the ones who calculated well, packed smart and kept moving, they arrived on the other side changed. Not just tired, changed. Because the crossing was not just a physical event. It was a reckoning. And the calendar was a ruthless part of that reckoning. Because here is something nobody tells you about mountain travel that the people who actually crossed these passes understood in their bones. It was not just about what you packed. It was about when you went. And getting that timing wrong by even a few weeks was a mistake that no amount of good packing could fix. The seasons ruled the passes the way kings ruled their kingdoms, absolutely, without mercy and without appeal. Of everything I have learned about mountain pass travel over the years, one fact has stayed with me more persistently than any other. It is not the distances, not the weights people carried, not even the deaths. It is this: the entire civilized world, trade, diplomacy, pilgrimage, communication, ran on a seasonal schedule dictated by weather patterns that nobody fully understood and that nobody could control. Kings could not override it. Popes could not negotiate with it. The wealthiest merchant in Europe could throw gold at the problem and it would not matter. When the mountain said no, the mountain meant it. And for most of the year, the high Alpine passes sat above 2,000 meters in the air, buried under snow wrapped in cloud, howling with wind, completely, absolutely impassable. The world for several months every year simply stopped. Let us talk about what that actually looked like in practice. The high passes of the Alps, the Great St. Bernard at nearly 2,500 meters, the St. Gotthard at 2,100 meters, the Mont Cenis, which was the favoured French route into Italy for centuries, were typically usable by ordinary travellers for only a few months of the year, roughly from June when the snowmelt began to expose the path until October, when the first serious winter storms rolled back in. That is 4 months, possibly 5 in a good year. 4 or 5 months out of 12. Think about that from a commercial standpoint. Every merchant who needed to move goods between Italy and the markets of Northern Europe had a window. A finite, weather-dependent, completely unpredictable window. Miss it through bad timing, bad luck, a delayed shipment, an illness that kept you in bed for 2 extra weeks, and you were not crossing the Alps this season. You were waiting until next June. And if your goods were perishable, your contracts were time-sensitive, your debts were due. Well, the mountain did not concern itself with your business problems. Now here is something I find remarkable about this. The communities that grew up around the mountain passes developed an almost obsessive sensitivity to seasonal signs. They watched the snow, they watched the wind, they watched the behavior of animals at altitude. They developed local knowledge that was genuinely extraordinary, the kind of nuanced, granular understanding of a microclimate that takes generations to accumulate and cannot be written down in any book. A shepherd who had spent 40 years on the slopes below the pass knew from the way the morning clouds formed over a particular ridge whether the next 3 days would be safe for travel. He knew it in his body the way you know the layout of your own house in the dark. And that knowledge was worth money. Real money. Because guides, local men who knew the passes intimately and could read the mountain's moods were not a luxury for Alpine crossings. They were a necessity. The records show that travellers paid significant sums for competent mountain guides, and they were right to do so. A guide who knew the route in fog, who knew where the path narrowed and where it widened, who knew which slopes were prone to sudden collapses after a heavy snowfall, and who knew when to stop, turn around and say, "Not today," that person was worth every coin they charged. But let me take you to the most dramatic illustration of what happens when you ignore the season. When you push past the window, when pride or desperation or strategic necessity convinces you that the mountain will make an exception for you. In the year 218 before the Common Era, so we're going back well over 2,000 years, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca stood at the foot of the Alps with one of the most extraordinary armies ever assembled, 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Let that sink in for a moment. 37 war elephants, in the Alps, in what was approaching winter. Hannibal was attempting something the Romans genuinely believed was impossible. He was taking his army over the mountains to invade Italy from the north, bypassing Roman naval dominance entirely, and appearing seemingly from nowhere on Roman soil. It was one of the boldest strategic gambits in military history, and the timing was catastrophic. By the time his army reached the foot of the Alpine passes, it was late September, possibly early October of that year. The window was not just closing, it was essentially closed. The snow had already returned to the high passes. The nights were brutal, the paths were icy. The mountain tribesmen who controlled the approaches were hostile and perfectly willing to roll boulders down onto the column from above. The Roman historian Livy, writing later, tried to capture what Hannibal's soldiers saw when they finally reached the summit of the pass. The towering peaks, the snow-clad pinnacles soaring to the sky, the rude huts clinging to the rocks, the people with their wild and ragged hair, all nature animate and inanimate, stiff with frost. And then he added in a line that I think is genuinely haunting, "All this and other sights, the horror of which words cannot express, gave a fresh edge to their apprehension." The crossing took 16 days. 16 days of cold snow, hostile attacks, steep descents where pack animals slipped and fell, and soldiers from North Africa and Spain who had never seen mountains like these in their lives, let alone crossed them in October. When Hannibal emerged on the Italian side, he had roughly 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left, according to the bronze tablet Hannibal himself erected recording his own numbers. He had entered the Alps with nearly twice that. Half his army, by some counts, simply did not make it through. This season took them. The mountain took them. Not Roman soldiers, not an opposing army, just the calendar and the snow. Now here is where I want to offer you a thought that historians do not always flag prominently. Hannibal knew. He was not naive about the timing. He was one of the most gifted military strategists in ancient history. He absolutely understood that he was crossing in the wrong season. He chose to go anyway, because waiting meant the Romans would reinforce their positions. Waiting meant his allies in northern Italy, the Gallic tribes who were eager to fight Rome, would cool off and reconsider. Waiting meant losing the element of surprise that the entire operation depended on. So he calculated, and he decided that the cost of the wrong season was still lower than the cost of delay. He was probably right. He went on to win some of the most decisive battles in ancient history. He won at the Trebia River in December of that same year. He won at Lake Trasimene the following spring. He won at Cannae in 216 before the Common Era, a battle in which at least 50,000 Roman soldiers were lost in a single afternoon, one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. All of that came after the crossing that should not have been survivable. So the lesson is not simply respect the season. Sometimes the lesson is calculate whether the risk of the wrong season is still worth taking. Sometimes it is, but you had better be very, very good at making that calculation, and you had better be willing to pay the price when the mountain collects what it is owed. Back now to the medieval world, because the season question played out very differently for ordinary travellers than it did for armies with strategic imperatives. For the pilgrim, for the wool merchant, for the papal envoy carrying letters between Rome and the German imperial court. The ideal window was well understood, even if nobody could guarantee it would hold. You departed in spring after the snow on the lower approaches had cleared enough to be passable. You arrived at the foot of the pass in early to mid-June when the summit route was opening up. You crossed, you arrived on the other side, you conducted your business, and you returned before the October storms closed everything back down. That was the plan. And plans, as anyone who has ever made them knows, are simply agreements between you and the future that the future is under no obligation to honour. A late spring storm could dump fresh snow on a pass that had seemed perfectly clear the week before. An early autumn cold snap could descend in late August weeks, before any experienced traveller would have expected it. The Spanish pilgrim, Pero Tafur, whose account I mentioned earlier, was crossing the St. Gothard Pass at the end of August summer technically, and found the snowmelt making the path so treacherously slippery that he considered it one of the most dangerous moments of his entire journey. End of August, summer, and the mountain was still trying to kill him. There is another dimension to the season question that I think gets overlooked, and I want to spend a moment with it because it says something profound about the medieval experience of time. In the modern world, we think of seasons primarily as temperature and weather. Summer is warm, winter is cold. We consult the calendar, check the forecast, make our plans. But for medieval travellers, the season carried a much heavier moral and religious weight. Certain times of year were considered propitious for travel. Others were considered dangerous not just meteorologically, but spiritually. Setting out on a significant journey at the wrong time could be read as hubris, as a failure to listen to the natural order that God had established. And there was a kind of collective intelligence in this, because the instinct that said, "Do not cross the mountain in November," was not irrational superstition. It was generations of hard-won knowledge encoded into cultural habit. The calendar ruled the passes, the seasons controlled the world, and the travellers who survived understood in their bones that the mountain did not care how urgently you needed to reach the other side. It would open when it was ready, and it would close when it chose. Here is a detail that I love and that brings all of this into very sharp focus. When the Grand Tour became fashionable among wealthy Europeans in the 17th and 18th centuries, young aristocrats travelling to Italy to complete their education, crossing the Alps remained an essential and terrifying part of the experience. And the method that developed for crossing the Mont Cenis Pass, which was the most popular French route into Italy during those centuries, was this: your carriage was disassembled entirely, taken apart piece by piece, and carried over the mountain on the backs of mules, while you, the distinguished traveller, were placed in a kind of open sedan chair and carried by Swiss porters, physically carried, by hand, up and over a mountain pass. And this was considered the luxury option. The crossing typically took 8 days. 8 days of being carried over icy, windswept terrain in an open chair, completely at the mercy of the mountain and the strength of the men carrying you. And still the season had to be right, even with wealth, even with porters and disassembled carriages and letters of introduction. The mountain had the final word. I keep coming back to a single image as I think about this. It is not a dramatic image. It is a quiet one. It is the image of a traveller standing at the foot of the pass in late May, looking up at the snow line, watching, waiting, trying to read the sky and the slope and the wind the way the local shepherds do, knowing that they cannot read it quite as well, knowing that the decision they are about to make could cost them everything. And then, when the signs seem right, when the snow has receded far enough up the slope, when the air feels stable and the clouds are high and the light has that particular quality it gets in early summer, mountain mornings, they take a breath and they start walking. Not because they are certain, but because the season will not wait forever, and the other side will not come to them. What the season taught the mountain traveller, and what I think it still teaches us in ways we have almost entirely forgotten, is that some things cannot be hurried. That there are systems larger than ourselves, older than our plans, and completely indifferent to our timetables. And the wisest response is not to fight them. It is to read them, to wait for the right moment, and then to move decisively without hesitation when that moment arrives. And speaking of moving at exactly the right moment, once you finally stepped onto the path and began the ascent into the high pass, a completely different set of challenges appeared. Ones that had nothing to do with timing, ones that had everything to do with the mountain itself. The road you were actually walking, the terrain under your feet, the physical reality of what it meant to climb a path that was in many places no wider than a person's outstretched arms, while carrying everything you needed to survive. That is the world we walk into next, and I promise you it is stranger and more harrowing and more extraordinary than you might expect. Somewhere in your mind right now, I suspect there is a picture. When you hear the phrase Mountain Pass Road, you probably imagine something that looks at least vaguely like a road, a surface, a path. Maybe something resembling a trail that humans intentionally built and other humans can follow without too much trouble. I want to gently dismantle that picture, because the reality of what travellers actually walked on when they crossed these mountain passes, particularly in the medieval period when Roman infrastructure had crumbled and modern road building was centuries away, is something that takes a moment to fully absorb. Let's start with the Romans, because they genuinely were extraordinary road builders, and understanding what they created helps you appreciate just how much was lost when their empire fell. The Via Claudia Augusta, the great Roman road that connected the Adriatic coast near Venice all the way north through the Alps to the Danube, was at its peak, a piece of engineering that would impress an infrastructure expert today. At most points along its roughly 520-kilometre length, it was 6 to 8 metres wide. That is about the width of a modern two-lane road. It had a cambered surface, meaning it was slightly rounded in the middle, so that rainwater and snowmelt would drain away to the sides rather than pooling on the road and turning it to mud. There were staging posts at regular intervals where horses could be changed. There were inns for travellers. There were traffic rules at narrow sections. Traffic rules on an Alpine mountain road in the 1st century of the Common Era. The Romans, it must be said, had their priorities extremely well organised. But then the Roman Empire fell, and here is what happened to that extraordinary engineering over the next several centuries. Nobody maintained it. The bridges began to rot. The surface, no longer cambered and drained by regular maintenance crews, slowly turned from a smooth gravel road into a muddy, rutted, uneven track. Carts travelling downhill, which in the Roman era would have simply braked and rolled smoothly, now carved grooves into the road surface so deep that sections of Alpine stone still bear those twin parallel channels, today carved by centuries of iron-wheeled vehicles grinding their way down slopes that had no other option for them. By the early medieval period, what had been a 6-metre highway was in many places a narrow mule track, barely wide enough for 2 animals to pass each other, and in the high passes themselves above the tree line, where the wind was constant and the rock was bare and the path had never been paved in the first place, it was often something even simpler than a track. It was a line of cairns, piles of stones, stacked by human hands over generations, saying in the oldest and most universal language imaginable this way: the cairns fascinate me more than almost anything else in this story, because they represent something so fundamental about human relationship with difficult terrain. When you cannot build a road, when the rock is too steep, the ice too shifting, the environment too hostile for anything permanent, you build a marker, a stone on a stone on a stone, pointing the way. At the Lenbreen Pass in Norway, that remarkable site I mentioned earlier, where the melting ice has been releasing artifacts from 1,000 years of mountain travel, archaeologists found more than 100 cairns marking the route up the northern slope over the summit and down the other side. 100 cairns. And here is what the researchers noted: this pass was far more heavily marked than any of the other known crossings on the same ridge. The other passes had almost no cairns at all. Which tells you something important: the people who marked Lenbreen so thoroughly were not doing it for the locals. The locals knew the way. They had known it for generations. Those 100 cairns were built for the strangers, the long-distance travellers who arrived from distant regions, who had never been to this mountain before, who looked up at a slope covered in snow and fog and had absolutely no idea which direction led to the other side. The cairns were in a very real sense an act of collective compassion across time. Someone who crossed the mountain built a marker so that the next person who crossed it would not have to guess. And that person built another one, and another, until the slope was lined with 100 small towers of stone, each one representing a moment when a human being stopped, picked up a rock, and thought, someone after me will need this. I find that quietly extraordinary. But even with cairns, even with knowledge, even with a guide who had crossed the pass before the terrain itself remained one of the most persistent and unpredictable enemies a traveller faced. let me describe what the actual physical experience of crossing a high alpine pass on foot would have been like, because I think it deserves more than a general impression. You begin in the valley. The path is manageable, a worn track through forest and meadow, rising gradually. Your legs are working but not screaming. The air is cool and pleasant. You feel perhaps cautiously optimistic. Then the trees begin to thin. Then they disappear entirely. You cross the tree line somewhere around 1700 to 1900 meters in the Alps, and suddenly the landscape changes completely. The ground is bare rock and scrub. The wind, which was a gentle companion below, becomes something else entirely up here. It has opinions, strong ones. It pushes against you on exposed ridges. It sends your broad-brimmed hat spinning if you're not careful. It cuts through your wool cloak in a way that reminds you very clearly that the cloak is your last line of defense, and you're extremely grateful you still have it. The path narrows as you climb. In some sections, particularly where the route must skirt around a rockfall or traverse a steep slope, it becomes nothing more than a ledge perhaps a meter wide, with the mountain rising sharply above you on one side and dropping away sharply below you on the other, and you're on that ledge with a pack on your back or leading a mule whose load shifts slightly with every step, whose hooves find purchase on the loose rock with varying degrees of success, and you're not allowed to think too carefully about what is happening. You just keep moving, because the alternative is to stop. And stopping on a narrow mountain ledge in the wind with the temperature dropping and the light going and the summit still somewhere above you stopping is not the answer. The Roman writer Polybius, describing Hannibal's crossing a passage, I find myself returning to often, because the observational precision in it is remarkable, wrote something that I think captures the physical reality of alpine terrain better than almost any other source. He described the road leading up to the pass as narrow and uneven, flanked by precipices, and then he wrote that the least movement or disorder in the line caused many of the animals to be forced over the edge with their loads. The least movement, the least disorder. On a path where thousands of people travelled, where trade and pilgrimage and diplomacy flowed for centuries, a small stumble, a moment of carelessness, a gust of wind at the wrong moment could send a loaded animal and everything it was carrying tumbling into the void. No recovery, no retrieval, just gone. Now there was one additional physical challenge of alpine terrain that nobody ever mentions in the romantic accounts of mountain crossing, and I want to spend a moment with it because it is genuinely important. The descent. Everyone thinks about the climb. The climb is hard, yes. The climb is exhausting. The climb is the part that takes the most time and requires the most physical effort. But the descent coming down the other side is where most of the accidents happened. On the way up you have gravity working against you, which means you slow down naturally. Your legs are pushing, your muscles are working, your pace is controlled. On the way down, gravity is working with you. And on a steep, loose-rocked path with leather soles on your feet, and possibly a heavy pack on your back or a nervous mule behind you, gravity working with you is not a friend. It is an invitation to move faster than you can safely manage. The medieval remedy for this on cart roads was to block one of the wheels, entirely wedge something under it, so it dragged rather than rolled, and let the vehicle scrape its way down the slope in a more or less controlled fashion, which is, you have to admit, a solution that works technically, just not particularly elegantly. For people on foot, the technique was simpler: lean back, take small steps, stay as close to the uphill side of the path as possible, and pray that the path was not icy, because icy meant something entirely different. Icy meant that no technique helped. Icy meant you went wherever the mountain decided to send you. Here is a detail that I want to share because I think it humanizes all of this in a very specific way. When Napoleon Bonaparte sent his army over the Great St. Bernard Pass in the year 1801, of the most famous Alpine crossings of the modern era depicted in that famous portrait of him on a rearing white horse, the reality of the descent was rather different from the painting. Napoleon himself followed his troops a couple of days later. He did not ride a magnificent white stallion. He sat on a mule, a plain, ordinary, sensible mule, and the records tell us that on the Italian side of the pass where the slope was steep and the path was treacherous, the French soldiers did not march down in disciplined formation. They sat down on the snow, and they slid. 6,000 soldiers per day, sliding down the Alpine slope on their own uniforms. Whole companies of the French army using the mountain as the world's most unplanned bobsled run. This is not in the famous portrait. It is, however, in the historical record, and I think it tells you something true about the mountain that the portrait does not. The mountain makes everyone practical eventually, but there is something I have not yet mentioned about these ancient roads that I think deserves its own moment. These sounds. Not the sounds of wind or water, those you might already imagine. I mean the human sounds. Because the mountain passes were not empty. Even the most remote and difficult of them at the height of their use were travelled by hundreds or thousands of people in the open months of the year. And those caravans of merchants and pilgrims and mule trains created a kind of acoustic landscape that we have entirely lost. The bells. Pack animals in the Alps and the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush were fitted with bells, not for sentiment, not for decoration, but because the paths were narrow enough that two trains meeting from opposite directions needed to hear each other coming long before they could see each other. The bell warned the other party someone is approaching. Find a wider section. Back up your mule. Wait. Those bells echoing off the rock walls of a narrow alpine gorge, dozens of them, hundreds of them at the height of the summer trading season, must have created a sound that no living person has ever heard. A kind of music made entirely by commerce and movement and the practical necessities of survival. And now it is gone. Silenced by the tunnel cut through the mountain in 1964, by the motorway that carries freight trucks in both directions at 100 kilometers per hour, by everything that made the old world obsolete. Do you ever wonder what sounds we're making right now that future generations will find remarkable? What will seem as strange and vanish to people 500 years from now, as those mule bells seem to us? I think about that sometimes. Not to be melancholy about it, but because it reminds me that history is not just the past, it is the present in disguise, and everything we are living through right now will one day be the thing that someone else tries to reconstruct and understand. The terrain of the mountain pass shaped everything that happened on it. Every decision about when to travel, what to carry, how to navigate, who to trust, all of it was shaped ultimately by the physical reality of the ground underfoot. And that physical reality was unforgiving, spectacular, dangerous, and genuinely alive in ways that the people who crossed it understood in their bodies, even if they could not always put it into words. They walked on roads that were sometimes Roman engineering and sometimes just a line of stones in the snow. They climbed slopes that narrowed to ledges. They descended other sides, clinging to the uphill edge or sliding on their own clothing. They listened for bells around corners. They kept their eyes on the cairn ahead. And somehow, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they got through. But here is the thing about getting through a mountain pass. The train was only the first layer of danger. The second layer was invisible. It could not be seen on the ground or read in the geography. It arrived without warning from above and inside and all around simultaneously. Cold, altitude, and the particular cruelty of a world that had no explanation for why people died on these mountains, no understanding of what altitude was doing to the human body, no theory of hypothermia, no science of avalanche prediction. Just a set of symptoms. A person who became confused and slow and could not feel their fingers. a person who lay down in the snow to rest and could not be woken. A wall of white falling from above with no sound until it was too late. The invisible killers of the mountain passes were in some ways more frightening than any of the physical terrain, because at least the terrain you could see. These things you could not, and the ways people tried to explain them and protect themselves from them is a story that is equal parts heartbreaking and astonishing. Right around 2,500 meters above sea level, roughly the height of the Great St. Bernard Pass on a clear summer day, something begins to happen inside the human body that nobody in the medieval world could explain, name, or fully understand. The air grows thinner, not visibly, not dramatically. There is no obvious sign that anything has changed. The sky above looks perfectly normal. The world around you looks exactly as it did 500 meters lower, but your blood is carrying less oxygen with every heartbeat. Your muscles are working harder for less reward. Your thinking very quietly and without announcing itself begins to slow. And if you are a medieval traveller crossing the Alps with no understanding of atmospheric pressure, no concept of oxygen, no physiological framework whatsoever, for what is happening inside your lungs, you're simply aware in a confused and frightening way that you feel wrong. Not sick exactly. Not injured, just wrong. And wrong in the mountains in the medieval world could become catastrophic before you had time to figure out why. The history of how humans came to understand altitude sickness is one of the most fascinating threads in the entire history of medicine. And it starts perhaps surprisingly not in Europe but in China. Around 30 years before the Common Era, so roughly 2,050 years ago, a Chinese official named Tu Qin wrote a formal report about his experiences travelling through the mountain passes of the Karakoram Range on the ancient Silk Road route through what is now Central Asia. And in this official document, among the practical details of the journey, he described certain mountains that his party crossed. He called them the Great Headache Mountain and the Little Headache Mountain. Not poetic names, literal ones. Because when you crossed them, your head throbbed with a pain unlike anything you experienced at lower elevations, and your animals behaved strangely, and people vomited, and some of the weaker members of the party simply could not continue until they descended. Tu Qin's account is remarkable for its plainness. He was not trying to be dramatic. He was not warning people away from the mountains out of superstition. He was writing an administrative report. And the Headache Mountains were simply a documented fact of the route, like noting that a particular river was wide, or that a certain section of road was steep. 4 centuries later, in the year 403 of the Common Era, a Chinese Buddhist monk named Fa Xian was making a remarkable journey through Central Asia, crossing mountain passes into what is now Afghanistan. His travel companion crossing one of the high passes suddenly became very ill. White foam appeared at the man's mouth, and then he died. What Fa Xian witnessed was almost certainly high-altitude pulmonary edema, what we now know to be a condition where fluid accumulates in the lungs at altitude, starving the body of oxygen so severely that it can be fatal within hours. But Fa Xian had no name for it, no explanation, no understanding of what had just happened to his companion. He wrote it down because it was strange and terrifying, and because he wanted to record honestly what the journey had cost. And in the absence of any scientific framework, the mountain traveller's world was full of these gaps, these frightening events that could only be attributed to something beyond the physical. Evil air, malevolent wind, the displeasure of spirits, God's judgment on the unworthy, the mountain as a moral test, not just a physical one. It was not until the 16th century that a European account finally put something closer to a scientific finger on what was happening at altitude. In the year 1570, a Spanish Jesuit priest named Father José de Acosta was ordered to cross the Andes in Peru. He did so with 14 or 15 companions through the Pariyakaka Pass, an ascent that reaches well above 4,000 meters, and what happened to the party there he described in his book published in 1590 in terms so vivid and so precise that physicians hundreds of years later would recognize them immediately as the textbook symptoms of acute mountain sickness. I want to give you his words paraphrased because he wrote in Spanish, but the feeling of them intact he had been told about this sickness. He had even dismissed it as exaggeration before experiencing it himself. And then at altitude he found himself unable to continue lying on the ground, certain for a time that he would die before the day was over. Around him his companions were in various states of collapse. Some had confessed to a priest along the way, convinced their end was upon them. Others were vomiting in the snow. One man had thrown himself to the earth, screaming from the pain. And the remarkable thing, the thing that Acosta noticed even in his own misery, was that as soon as they descended, everyone felt better. The further down the mountain they went, the more the symptoms eased. And from this observation, Acosta drew a conclusion that was genuinely ahead of its time. The air at these heights was too thin and too delicate for human breathing. He had identified the mechanism, not in modern scientific terms, but in principle he understood the air itself was the problem. It would take another 300 years for Paul Bert, the French physiologist, to demonstrate definitively in 1878 that altitude sickness was caused by a deficiency of oxygen in the body's tissues. But Acosta got there first by observation alone in a letter written from Peru in the year 1570. Now, for medieval European alpine travellers crossing at 2,000 to 2,500 metres, which was the typical altitude of the major passes, altitude sickness in its most severe forms was relatively rare. The Alps are simply not as high as the Andes, but the milder symptoms, the headache, the fatigue that felt out of proportion to the effort, the slight confusion and the strange sense that your body was not quite performing as it should, these were real and common and completely mysterious. And the explanations that people reached for in the absence of anything better are a window into how the medieval mind made sense of physical experience. Some believed the air of the high passes was inherently poisonous, filled with miasmas, invisible clouds of bad air rising from the rock or the ice. Others believed that the mountains themselves were inhabited by forces hostile to human presence, not metaphorically hostile, but literally supernaturally hostile. Crossing a high pass was in this understanding an act of trespass, and the sickness that sometimes followed was the mountain's response, a warning, or a punishment. What fascinates me about this is not that it was wrong. Of course it was wrong. But it was a way of organizing a frightening and inexplicable experience into a framework that the traveller could act upon. You could not fight low oxygen. You could not negotiate with a pressure gradient, but you could pray. You could bring a relic. You could perform the right rituals before setting out and hope that the forces of the mountain would be appeased. Whether any of that worked is beside the point. The point is that humans confronted with something they cannot explain will always build a story around it. And the stories they built around the invisible dangers of mountain travel are often more revealing than the science that eventually replaced them. Let me shift now to the second invisible killer, the cold. Because the cold was different from altitude sickness in one important way: its effects were visible. You could see someone becoming hypothermic. You just could not name what you were seeing or understand why it was happening. The progression of severe cold exposure in a human body, as if you have never encountered it, described in detail, genuinely alarming. It begins with shivering, which is actually the body doing exactly the right thing, generating heat through rapid muscle movement. Then the shivering stops, not because the person is warming up, because the body has given up on that strategy. What comes next is a dangerous, seductive warmth. The blood vessels near the skin dilate, flooding the extremities with the last reserves of the body's heat. And the person paradoxically feels better, less cold. even comfortable for a moment. This is the most dangerous phase, because what follows the warmth is confusion, and after the confusion a profound, peaceful desire to lie down, and once someone in severe cold exposure lies down in the snow and closes their eyes, they very often do not get up. Medieval travellers had no name for this process. They had no clinical framework. What they observed was that companions who seemed to be recovering would suddenly become incoherent, would begin to remove their clothing convinced they were overheating, would sit down to rest and become impossible to rouse. The medical understanding of the day attributed this to an imbalance of humours, the cold and wet humours overwhelming the warm and dry ones. The treatments that were recommended, recorded by physicians like Paul of Aegina in the 7th century, included placing the victim in a warm room and rubbing them with warm oils, which is, it must be said, actually not bad advice. Warming slowly, physical contact. The basic principles of treating hypothermia arrived at through observation rather than theory, 1200 years before anyone understood what hypothermia actually was. But perhaps the most sudden and the most absolute of the invisible killers was the avalanche, because an avalanche gave almost no warning. There was no building headache, no slow confusion, no opportunity to sit down and reason through what was happening. One moment the slope above was still, and then it was not. The section of path near the Great St. Bernard Pass was called, and has been called for centuries, the Combe des Morts, in French that translates simply as the Valley of the Dead. Not a poetic name, a documentary one. Avalanches swept through that corridor with such regularity that it earned its name honestly and kept it across many generations. In January of 1718, a wall of snow destroyed every house in the Swiss alpine village of Leukerbad, killing 52 people. Less than a century earlier, in 1861, people had died in exactly the same village from exactly the same cause. The mountain had struck the same community twice, in the same way, in the same place, separated by 2 centuries, and the second time killed almost as many as the first. Here is what makes avalanches such a particular terror, historically speaking. They were not random. They were not unpredictable exactly. The same slopes released again and again. The same valleys funneled the snow into the same paths year after year. And people knew this. Local knowledge of avalanche terrain was genuine, specific, and passed down through generations with great seriousness. The medieval approach to avalanche warning was not sophisticated by modern standards, but it was not uninformed. Experienced alpine guides knew which slopes were dangerous after fresh snowfall. They knew the particular sound, a low distant crack that sometimes preceded a release. There was a practice documented at the Great St. Bernard Hospice of firing weapons before entering dangerous sections of the route, specifically to bring down any loose snow deliberately in a controlled way, before travellers pass beneath it. Controlled avalanche release. The same principle that modern ski patrol teams use today with dynamite and artillery shells instead of muskets. Centuries before anyone understood the mechanics of snow loading and fracture propagation, before any of these concepts existed, the monks and guides of the Alpine passes had discovered through painful trial and error that you could sometimes make the mountain release its danger on your terms rather than its own. That is not superstition. That is hard-won empirical knowledge, and it saved lives. I want to pause here and offer you a thought that I have been sitting with for a long time. We tend to look at the past at people who did not have germ theory, or atmospheric science, or the concept of oxygen, and see their ignorance as the most important thing about them, as if not knowing explains everything about how they lived. But here is what strikes me every time I read about how medieval mountain travellers dealt with altitude sickness. They could not name or cold, they could not fully explain or snow that fell without warning from a sky that showed no sign of danger. They were paying an extraordinarily close kind of attention. They were watching the mountain, watching the sky, watching their companions, watching the snow. And from that watching across generations, they built a body of practical knowledge that was genuinely effective. Not perfect, not complete, not theoretically correct, but effective enough that millions of crossings happened and most of them succeeded. The invisible killers took people. They always did. But they took fewer people than they might have because the communities around these passes were watching and learning and passing what they learned to the next person who stood at the foot of the mountain and looked up. And speaking of what people found when they looked to those who had already made the crossing before them, there is one chapter of this story that I think is the most extraordinary of all. The chapter about what happened at the top of the pass. Not the dangers, not the cold or the thin air or the snow, but the structures that humans built in those impossible places, the shelters, the hospices, the refuges maintained for generations by people who had chosen deliberately and permanently to live at the top of the world in order to help strangers pass through safely. Because if altitude and cold and avalanche were the invisible killers of the mountain passes, then the people at the summit were the invisible guardians, and their story, the story of how far ordinary human compassion can stretch when the stakes are life and survival, is one I have been saving for exactly this moment. Imagine that you have just survived the worst day of your journey. The snow came in faster than anyone expected. The wind has been trying to knock you sideways for the last 4 hours. Your feet stopped feeling like feet some time ago. They are just two cold things at the end of your legs that you keep moving forward out of habit. Your companion has barely spoken in an hour. The dog that was supposed to mark the safe path disappeared into the white ahead of you and has not returned. And then through the storm you see something. A shape. Not rock, not ice, a structure. Stone walls rising from the summit ridge. Light faint but real in a window. And you understand in the particular way that exhausted people understand things that you're going to be all right. Because someone built this here. Someone chose to live here. At 8,000 feet above sea level. In the worst weather on the continent. For you, the Great St. Bernard Hospice stands today as it has stood for nearly 1,000 years at 2,469 meters above sea level on the pass between Switzerland and Italy. It is one of the oldest continuously operating mountain refuges in the world, and the story of how it came to be and what it did for the people who reached its doors is, I genuinely believe, one of the most moving stories in the entire history of mountain travel. The founding of the hospice is credited to a man named Bernard of Menthon. He was the Archdeacon of Aosta, a senior church official in the region, and around the year 1050 he looked at the situation on the Great St. Bernard Pass with clear eyes. He saw travellers arriving at towns below the pass terrorised, robbed, some barely alive. He saw that the pass had no infrastructure, no reliable shelter, no protection against either the weather or the bandits who preyed on travellers at altitude, where there was nobody to help them, and he decided quietly and practically to fix it. He established a hospice at the summit. Not a grand plan, not a political statement, just a building, with walls thick enough to keep the wind out, with a fire, with food, with beds, and with a community of canons, religious men bound by vow to remain at the pass and serve travellers, regardless of the season, regardless of the weather, regardless of the cost to themselves. That community has been there ever since. Nearly 1,000 years of unbroken hospitality. Think about that number. The hospice has been continuously welcoming travellers since before the First Crusade, since before the Magna Carta existed, since before the great cathedrals of Europe were built. Someone asked a monk at the hospice's reception desk not many years ago whether the doors would be locked at a particular hour. The monk looked at him with what can only be described as gentle exasperation. "Monsieur," he replied, "we haven't closed our doors since 1050. Who knew monks could do deadpan comedy quite so well? But let us not let the humour obscure what that statement actually means. The winters at the Great St. Bernard Pass are not kind. The pass sits under deep snow for up to 7 months of every year. At the height of its medieval operation, the hospice was sometimes completely cut off from the outside world for months at a time. No resupply, no communication, no way down that was not genuinely dangerous. And yet the canons stayed. This was not an accident. This was not convenience. This was a deliberate, sustained, multi-generational act of human solidarity with strangers. The records tell us that in some particularly harsh winters, the number of pilgrims stranded at the hospice was so large that the community had to slaughter a cow every single day for a month just to keep everyone fed. A cow per day, for a month, at 8,000 feet, in the middle of winter. Medieval popes and Holy Roman emperors who crossed the pass donated lands, rights and privileges to the hospice, in thanks not as a formality, but because they had personally experienced what it meant to arrive exhausted and cold at those walls and be taken in without question. The hospice asked nothing of the travellers it served. No payment, no loyalty oath, no proof of worthiness. If you arrived at the door, you were welcomed. That was the entire policy. And many of the canons who maintained that policy over the centuries died doing it. The encyclopedia entry notes this plainly. Many of the canons gave their lives in their work, not in dramatic rescues, just in the slow accumulation of winter after winter, spent at altitude, the cold wearing on the body, the isolation wearing on the spirit. They knew what they were choosing. They chose it anyway. Now I want to tell you about the morgue, because the hospice had a morgue, and I think the existence of that morgue tells you something about the scale of what the mountain could do, and what the monks were quietly dealing with season after season for centuries. The bodies of travellers who did not make it to the hospice in time, found frozen on the slopes recovered from beneath the snow, were brought back by the canons and placed in a sealed building beside the main structure. The cold at that altitude was so severe and so consistent that bodies were naturally preserved. Not for days, not for weeks, but for years. Sometimes for decades. The purpose was practical and compassionate simultaneously, to preserve the bodies so that their families, if they ever came looking, could identify them, so that the dead would not simply vanish into the mountain anonymous and unclaimed, so that someone somewhere might eventually know what had happened to the person who set out and did not return. Charles Dickens visited the Great St. Bernard Hospice in the year 1846, and what he saw in the mortuary haunted him enough that he used it as the centrepiece of a scene in his novel Little Dorrit, published over a decade later. He described the frozen travellers still in the positions in which they had been found. A mother standing in a corner, her child at her breast, both of them preserved exactly as the mountain had taken them. A man with his arm raised to his mouth as if against cold or hunger, his dry lips still pressed against it after years and years. Dickens, who had seen more than his share of London's grim realities, was shaken. He wrote, "An awful company mysteriously come together." But here is the thing I find most striking about the morgue. It was not hidden. It was right there a few steps from the door where travellers came in for warmth and bread. The living and the dead separated by a stone wall and 6 paces of snow. And the canons maintained both with equal care. The warmth for the living, the dignity for the dead. Neither was less important than the other. And then there were the dogs. The St. Bernard dogs deserve their own moment in this story because the history of how they came to be rescue animals and the reality of how they worked is considerably more interesting than the famous barrel around the neck image suggests. Sometime between the year 1660 and 1670, the canons of the hospice acquired their first dogs. They came most likely as gifts from families in the valleys below large sturdy farm dogs bred for cold mountain environments. Initially they were kept as guard dogs. watch animals for a building that sat isolated at a mountain summit, surrounded by the darkness of alpine winter, and the occasional presence of people who had not always survived by honest means. But the canons quickly noticed something. These dogs had abilities that went beyond guarding. They could move through snow that would stop a human immediately. They could find a scent a buried person sent through several feet of compacted snow, and they were apparently willing without training specific to the task to dig, to alert, to stay with a person in the cold until help arrived. The first written record of a dog at the hospice is from the year 1707. The entry is brief and practical in the way that institutional records tend to be. It says simply, "A dog was buried by us." Not celebrated, not mourned in any particular way. Just noted, one of the family, part of the work, gone now. By the mid-18th century, the dogs were being deliberately trained and deployed as search and rescue animals, pairs of them patrolling the pass during snowstorms, working ahead of the monks who would follow their tracks to find victims buried in the snow. The pair system was elegant in its simplicity. One dog would stay with the person who'd been found lying on top of them, providing warmth, licking their face, keeping them conscious. The other dog would return to the hospice, running, urgent, barking at the monks until the humans understood, "Follow me." Over nearly 200 years of documented operation, the dogs of the Great St. Bernard were credited with saving approximately 2,000 lives. 2,000 people who would otherwise have been numbers in the morgue, and the most famous of all these dogs, the one whose name became synonymous with the breed itself, was Barry. Barry was born at the hospice in the year 1800, the same year Napoleon's army crossed the pass. He was lighter and smaller than the St. Bernards we know today. He worked the pass for 12 years from 1800 to 1812, and in those 12 years he is credited with saving the lives of more than 40 people. The stories told about him are extraordinary, and some are legendary rather than documented. The most famous involves a small boy found asleep in a cave of ice so deeply cold that he could barely move. Barry found him, warmed him by lying against him, licked him conscious, and then, according to the legend, which I absolutely love, even though it almost certainly did not happen quite this way, carried the boy on his back to the hospice. A 100-pound dog carrying a half-frozen child across a snowy alpine pass. Now the reality was probably less dramatic, but it was not less heroic. The reality was a dog working in wind and snow and cold, hour after hour, season after season, finding person after person who without him would not have been found. No praise, no reward, just the work. In 1812, Barry was old and tired. The hospice prior sent him down to the city of Bern, where he spent his final 2 years in comfortable retirement. He died in 1814 peacefully in a warm place, and his body was preserved taxidermied and placed in the Natural History Museum of Bern, where it still stands today. There is a monument to him at a famous cemetery for animals near Paris. The inscription on the monument says, "He saved the lives of 40 people. He was killed by the 41st. The legend attached to that inscription is that Barry's 41st rescue attempt ended when the half-frozen soldier he was trying to revive woke up, mistook him for a wolf and stabbed him. This did not happen. Barry died in bed in Bern, old and grey and tired, but I understand why the legend was created. When a dog does what Barry did for 12 years, people feel that the ending should be commensurate with the life. A quiet death in a comfortable room does not feel equal to a career spent pulling people from the snow. So the legend gave him a more dramatic ending. The human need to make the story fit the scale of the life. I think Barry would have been entirely unbothered by the inaccuracy. He was not working for the story. What I find most remarkable about the Great St. Bernard Hospice, and I have spent a long time sitting with this, is not the dogs. As extraordinary as they are, it is the canons. The men who chose year after year, century after century to live at 8,000 feet in one of the most inhospitable places in Europe, for no reward other than the knowledge that someone who would otherwise have died tonight was going to be warm. They are the ones who went out into the dark during storms to find people. They are the ones who maintained the morgue with care and dignity. They are the ones who kept the fire going for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years. People who could have lived more comfortable lives, who had the education and the standing to choose something easier, and who chose this instead. When I think about what it means to be human, what we are capable of when we decide to commit entirely to something larger than ourselves, the canons of the great St. Bernard Pass are very near the top of my list. They were not famous. Most of them are not remembered by name. They were just there, every winter, for 1,000 years, with the door open. And I want to leave you with one image from the hospice that I cannot get out of my mind. The monks who go out during storms to search for lost travellers do not go out alone. They never did. They went in groups, and before they went they prayed. Not for success exactly, not asking God to guarantee a rescue, but offering the act itself, the going out, the searching, the willingness to be in the cold and the dark and the uncertainty as a kind of gift. There is something about that image that I find profoundly settling. Not the result, the going, the commitment to go regardless of what the outcome would be. Now, the hospice at the Great St. Bernard Pass was arguably the most famous of the Alpine refuges, but it was not the only one. And the question of protection on the mountain passes went far beyond monks and dogs and charity, because not everyone waiting on the mountain pass had your well-being in mind. There were those who had studied the patterns of travellers just as carefully as any guide or shepherd, who knew which sections of the path were narrow, who knew where a group of travellers would have to slow down, who knew that at that particular curve in the pass there was no way to see ahead, and no way to call for help. The bandits of the mountain passes were an entirely different kind of human being than the canons, and the world they created on the road between the valley and the summit, the system of tolls, threats, and the thin line between legitimate taxation and outright robbery, is a story that is darker, stranger, and considerably more complicated than it first appears. There is a question that I think every sensible person eventually asks when they learn about medieval mountain travel, and the question is simply this: where did the money go? All those merchants crossing the Alpine passes, all those traders carrying silk and wool and spices and silver, thousands of them, year after year, moving from the markets of Italy to the markets of Germany and back again. Where did the money flow? Who was capturing value from all of that movement? And the answer, when you pull it apart and look at it honestly, is one of the most layered and surprising stories in the entire history of commerce. Because the answer is almost everyone. Let us start with the official picture. In the medieval world, the right to collect tolls from travellers and merchants was considered a legitimate exercise of power, not a crime. Not even particularly controversial. It was simply how things worked. If you controlled a bridge, you collected a toll for crossing it. If you controlled a mountain pass, you collected a toll for using it. If you were a local lord through whose territory a major road happened to run, you had the legal right, often codified in royal charters, to set up a toll station and charge whoever came through. The logic was straightforward. You maintained the road or the bridge or the safety of the route. You deserved compensation. In the Holy Roman Empire, this principle had its own formal legal name, the Geleitrecht, which translates roughly as the right of escort. You paid the local lord. The local lord guaranteed your safe passage through his territory. And if someone robbed you anyway, well, the lord was technically responsible for making it right. Theoretically. In practice, this guarantee was worth considerably less than it sounded. The toll system on the Alpine passes was, even by the standards of medieval commerce, impressively elaborate. A merchant moving goods from Venice to Augsburg in the 14th century would encounter tolls at the foot of the pass, tolls at the summit, tolls on the approach roads, tolls at the bridges that crossed the rivers in the valleys, tolls at the gates of towns they passed through on either side of the mountains, and tolls for specific goods because certain commodities, particularly salt, were subject to special transportation laws that required them to be unloaded, handed off to licensed local carriers and reloaded. Which meant, of course, additional fees at each transfer point. Salt in the medieval world was not merely a seasoning, it was a preservative, a currency, a strategic resource. Control over its movement was a source of enormous power, and the men who controlled the Alpine passes understood that perfectly. On the Via Claudia Augusta, the ancient Roman road that had fallen into disrepair after the empire collapsed, local dynasties took it upon themselves to renovate sections of the route. The Starkenberger family from Tyrol, for instance, invested in the improvement of the road between two of the mountain passes in the region, which sounds generous, until you consider that they then recouped their investment through toll payments, which they continued collecting long after the investment had been repaid, long enough that contemporary travellers began referring to them not as benefactors of the road, but as highway robbers. The distinction between legitimate toll collector and highway robber in the medieval world was as a rule remarkably thin. Now here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. For every layer of official toll collection there was an unofficial layer underneath it, a shadow economy of the mountain pass. Let me explain what I mean. A merchant moving valuable goods through a mountain pass had several options when it came to protecting what he carried. He could hire armed guards, mercenaries who specialized in escort duty, sometimes called in the Frankish territories by names that translate roughly as adventurers or companions. He could travel in a large group, hoping that safety in numbers would discourage opportunistic attack. He could purchase official letters of safe conduct from a lord powerful enough that even bandits respected his authority. Or he could simply pay, not at official toll stations, but to whoever in the pass had the practical ability to make his journey difficult. Because in the narrowest sections of the mountain corridors where the path reduced to a ledge and there was truly nowhere to go except forward, whoever stood in front of you had enormous leverage, and whoever stood behind you in the dark also had leverage. This was not theoretical. The records of medieval Alpine commerce are full of references to payments made for protection, or for goodwill, or for escort through the difficult section, language that every reader of those documents understood to mean something slightly different from what the words literally said. But the most extraordinary example of the mountain pass as both commerce and power, the purest distillation of everything I'm describing, is not in the Alps at all. It is in the Khyber Pass, 53 kilometers of narrow gorge threading through the mountains between what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Khyber has been in continuous use as a route for armies, caravans, pilgrims and conquerors for over 3,000 years. Cyrus the Great of Persia marched through it. Alexander the Great and his generals used it. The Silk Road ran through it. Every major invasion of the Indian subcontinent that came from the northwest came through this one impossibly narrow corridor. And living in and around that corridor for all of those centuries were the Afridi and Shinwari clans of the Pashtun people. And these tribes had a very clear and consistent policy about the Khyber. It was theirs, not in some abstract sense, theirs, and if you wanted to use it you paid. This was not considered banditry. This was considered their livelihood, their right, their inheritance from however many generations back anyone could remember. By the time the Mughal Emperor Akbar was trying to secure reliable passage through the Khyber in the 16th century, he was paying the Afridi tribes the equivalent of 125,000 rupees every year. Not as conquest, not as tribute from a defeated enemy, as fees, as the price of access to a road. When Akbar's successors became less attentive to these payments, the tribes became less cooperative, and the pass became less safe. When the British arrived in the 19th century, they tried a combination of military force and payment. They learned fairly quickly that the payment worked considerably better than the force, because you can defeat an enemy in open battle. You cannot defeat a family that has lived in a particular gorge for centuries and knows every rock and shadow in it. The Afridian Shinwari were not bandits, they were toll collectors. They just happened to be toll collectors who were also armed, deeply territorial, and utterly indifferent to the political claims of whoever currently considered themselves to be in charge of the region. Now let me take you back to Europe for a moment, because I want to explore something that I find genuinely fascinating about how travellers responded to all of this, because they were not passive about it. Medieval merchants were almost by definition people who had thought very carefully about money and how it moved in the world. They were not going to simply pay every toll they encountered without trying to find ways around it, and the strategies they developed were in some cases genuinely ingenious. The simplest strategy was camouflage. If you were travelling without a proper escort, the first rule was do not look wealthy. Do not brag about what you are carrying. Dress plainly. Travel without obvious displays of coin or silver. Let your pack animals look like ordinary farm animals carrying unremarkable loads, rather than a merchant caravan transporting the season's most valuable commodities. This was common enough that it had become something of a practice in medieval commerce, the deliberate reduction of visible wealth as a survival strategy. The man who looked like a poor farmer was less interesting to a bandit than the man who looked like a prosperous merchant, even if both were actually carrying the same goods. Beyond camouflage, there was the strategy of letters and exemptions. Certain merchants' guilds and religious institutions held royal or papal charters that exempted them from specific tolls. A merchant travelling on behalf of a powerful abbey or carrying goods under the seal of a king could sometimes pass through a toll station without paying, provided the toll collector respected the authority behind the seal, which was not guaranteed, but it was worth attempting, and behind that was the strategy of finding alternative routes. If a particular pass was known to be under the control of a family that was currently extracting particularly aggressive tolls, merchants would simply use a different pass, even if it was longer, harder, and more dangerous, until the first family moderated its rates. This created a kind of market, however brutal and informal. The toll collector who charged too much would eventually find the traffic routing around him. The one who charged a fair rate, or at least a predictable one, would find the traffic returning. The mountain pass is a marketplace of extortion, where the rates were set not by law, but by the collective decision-making of thousands of individual merchants calculating their own risk. And then there was the most extreme version of the shadow economy, the period between the year 889 and the year 973, 84 years, during which a community of raiders operating from a base on the coast of Provence, referred to in contemporary chronicles as Saracens, originating from what is now the area of Saint-Tropez in southern France, effectively controlled several of the major Alpine passes, not taxed them, controlled them. For 8 decades they blocked Christian traffic through the western Alpine routes. This was not merely inconvenient, it was a geopolitical catastrophe. Trade between northern and southern Europe, all the commerce, all the pilgrimage, all the diplomatic travel that flowed through those narrow corridors in the mountains simply stopped, or rerouted, or happened underground in smaller, quieter, riskier ways. They held the Great St. Bernard Pass itself until the year 972. Think about that. A community of perhaps a few dozen raiders initially grown into a sustainable operation over decades, controlling the mountain passes of the Central Alps for nearly a century. It is one of the most audacious acts of geographic control in European history, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. When Christian forces finally expelled them in 973, Transalpine trade resumed, and the records show that it resumed quickly, as if the merchants had been waiting with their packs ready, watching the horizon. Because of course they had. What I find most thought-provoking about all of this, the official tolls and the unofficial ones, the Afridi tribes and the Saracen raiders and the Starkenberger dynasty, and their highway robbery dressed up as road improvement, is the way it reveals something fundamental about geography and power. Mountains do not just shape travel, they shape economics, they shape who has leverage. A mountain pass is in essence a monopoly. If there is only one practical route through a range, whoever controls that route controls everything that passes through it. They do not need an army to exercise that power. They do not need a king's seal or a papal blessing. They just need to be there, in the gap, at the narrow place. Have you ever been stuck somewhere, a gate, a checkpoint, a bottleneck of some kind, where someone with very limited actual authority had enormous practical power over your next 30 minutes? That was the entire medieval mountain pass. Every day, for centuries. And the people who made their living from that choke point, whether as official toll collectors, as tribal guardians claiming ancestral rights, or as straightforward armed opportunists, were simply exploiting one of the most ancient and universal truths of human geography. Whoever controls the narrow place controls the flow. The traveller who survived all of this, who paid the right tolls, outmaneuvered the wrong ones, avoided the bandits, stayed on the right side of the tribal gatekeepers, eventually emerged from the pass onto the other side of the mountain. And what waited for them there was the part of the journey that nobody writes about nearly enough. The night, where you slept, whether you slept, and the extraordinary calculus of who you trusted with your life when the sun went down on a mountain road with no walls between you and the dark. Because the choice of shelter, where to stop, who to sleep near, how to secure your goods, how to judge whether the man offering you a bed was genuinely hospitable or something else entirely, that choice was as important as anything that happened during the day, and the unwritten rules of mountain hospitality were as complex and as vital and as fascinating as any of the other systems we've explored tonight. Let me ask you something. When you go somewhere unfamiliar, a new city, a hotel room you've never stayed in before, what is the first thing you do after you set down your bag? You look around. You orient yourself. You note where the door is, whether the lock works, what the view outside tells you about the neighbourhood. You're doing in a matter of seconds exactly what every traveller in human history has always done. You're assessing whether this place will keep you safe until morning. In the modern world, that assessment takes seconds. In the medieval world of mountain travel, it could take hours, and the wrong answer could end everything. The night was the most dangerous part of any long journey. Not the mountain itself necessarily, not the weather, the night. Because the night levelled all the advantages that a careful prepared traveller had built up during the day. The pack of goods carefully secured, the route memorised, the awareness of who was behind you and who was ahead. All of that went quiet in the dark, and in its place came something simpler and more primal, the question of who else was in the room. To understand what overnight accommodation looked like for medieval mountain travellers, you have to first let go of any assumptions rooted in modern hotel experience. There was no private room with a lock, not for most people, not on a mountain road. What you got if you were lucky was a space. In a town below the pass, that space might be an inn, a building with a main hall where travellers ate and drank together, and a sleeping area above or adjacent where somewhere between 3 and 12 people shared a room, and where 2 or 3 of you might share a single bed with strangers you had met that evening. Not for lack of space necessarily. That was simply how it worked. Shared beds were the norm, not the exception across Europe for most of the medieval period. even in respectable establishments, even for respectable people. The shock is not that people shared beds with strangers. The shock to a modern mind is how completely normal this was. You arrived, you paid, you were shown to a bed. And whoever else was sleeping in it that night was simply the person whose journey had brought them to the same inn on the same evening. You nodded, you lay down, you slept, or you tried to. One account from the period describes the particular symphony of a medieval inn at night. Drunken vomiting from the hall below, dogs barking in the yard, the snoring of strangers at close quarters, the occasional crash of something falling in the dark. It sounds exhausting. It was exhausting. But it was also in a way I find genuinely moving, a kind of enforced democracy. The road made equals of people who would never otherwise have shared a meal, let alone a sleeping space. The wool merchant and the minor nobleman, the German pilgrim and the Italian trader, the Dominican friar and the servant carrying dispatches for a distant court. All of them horizontal in the same room, waiting for the same morning. Now along the Silk Road and through the mountain passes of Central Asia and the Middle East, the overnight accommodation infrastructure had evolved into something considerably more sophisticated. The caravanserai. These were purpose-built structures placed at intervals of roughly 30 to 40 kilometers along major trade routes, which is to say one day's journey apart, built solidly, often fortified, entered through a massive gate that was locked and guarded at night. Within the walls, stabling for the animals, storage rooms for the goods, wells or cisterns for water, a courtyard where merchants could sleep in the open air in warm seasons, small rooms opening onto that courtyard for those who needed more privacy or who carried more valuable cargo, and in the larger caravanserais something more spaces for worship, for bathing, sometimes even for trade itself. The caravanserai was essentially the world's first combined truck stop, warehouse, market, hotel and community centre, all in one walled compound, all available for no charge or nominal charge in the great ones funded by generous rulers, and the practice of building them was deliberate, systematic and deeply political. Because the ruler who built caravanserais along a trade route was not just being generous, he was sending a message to every merchant who travelled that route: this road is safe, this road is maintained, this road is worth using. Use it, and your taxes and your trade will make us both wealthy. The caravanserai was statecraft disguised as hospitality, but the mountain passes of the Alps, of course, had a different infrastructure. Above the tree line, above the settlements and the inns and the village monasteries, there was very little in the way of planned shelter. There was the hospice at the summit, which we've already talked about. But on the approach roads and on the longer sections between villages on the descents, travellers faced a more improvised situation. Some slept outdoors, not as a preference, as a necessity. The cloak that was so essential during the day doubled as a blanket at night. A sheltered spot behind a boulder or in the lee of a rock face was the difference between a cold night and a genuinely dangerous one. And experienced mountain travellers knew the value of these spots. They passed that knowledge on. The hollow beneath this overhang stays wind-free. The south-facing bank at the second bend of the descent holds warmth from the afternoon sun well into the night. This particular bend in the valley blocks the worst of the north wind. That knowledge accumulated over generations was not written in any book, but it was real, and it kept people alive. The monastic network was for medieval European travellers perhaps the most reliable overnight system of all. Monasteries and convents along pilgrimage routes were by religious obligation expected to provide hospitality. This was not merely a courtesy, it was a doctrinal requirement. The Benedictine rule, which governed the lives of monks across much of medieval Europe, stated explicitly that all guests who arrive shall be received as Christ. Those are remarkable words. All guests, not all wealthy guests, not all guests with proper letters of introduction, all guests. The stranger who arrived at a monastery gate in the evening, tired and cold, was to be received with the same welcome given to Christ himself, arriving at the door. This was taken seriously. And along the main Alpine routes, the roads that led to Rome via the Great Passes monasteries positioned themselves at regular intervals precisely because they understood their role in this network. The most reliable of them had proper guest quarters, separate from the monks' own cells, with a fire, with a meal, with a guaranteed right to sleep without fear, not luxury, but safety. And in the mountains, safety was the only luxury that mattered. Here is what I find most striking about the overnight experience on mountain roads. The social information that passed between travellers during those shared evenings was as valuable, possibly more valuable, than anything they were physically carrying. Think about it. You're at an inn below a mountain pass. Around the fire that evening are a merchant who crossed the pass 3 days ago, coming the other way, a monk who has travelled this route 4 times, a young shepherd who knows the upper slopes in every season. The information available in that room, the current state of the road, the location of ice on the descent, which sections had been swept by rockfall recently, whether there were armed men operating near the summit, whether the weather was likely to hold tomorrow, all of that was worth more than a map. Because maps of mountain terrain in the medieval world were at best approximate. But the man who crossed this specific pass 3 days ago and was sitting right beside you, he was a real-time intelligence briefing, and the culture of information exchange at these wayside stops was genuine. People talked, they asked questions, they compared notes, and crucially they warned each other. If someone had encountered a stretch of road that was unusually dangerous, or a group of travellers ahead who seemed suspicious, or a section of path that had collapsed since the last person came through, they said so. Because in the mountains, what you did not know could kill the person sitting next to you. And in the morning, that person was going to go exactly where you had just come from. The moral code of mountain travel was in many ways more reliable than the legal code. There was a widespread understanding cutting across religions, across nationalities, across social classes that to harm someone who had slept under your roof or shared your fire was a profound violation. The Germanic concept of Gastrecht, the right of guests, made the guests sacred for the duration of their stay. To violate a guest was not just illegal, it was a stain on the household that could not be washed away. The Islamic tradition of hospitality was even more absolute. A guest once welcomed into your shelter was under your protection. Harming them was an act that brought dishonour that followed a family for generations. These were not merely ideals. They were enforced by social pressure, by reputation, by the knowledge that word travelled fast on mountain roads. An innkeeper who robbed his guests or who allowed his guests to come to harm would find himself without travellers within a season. And without travellers on a mountain pass road there was no economy. There was nothing. But here is where the picture darkens just slightly. Because not every establishment along these routes was honourable. The records are clear enough about this. Some inns had, how shall I put it, reputations of a different kind. Travellers could be directed by false signs or misleading advice away from reputable establishments, and toward ones where the innkeeper had less scrupulous arrangements with certain parties who operated in the night. Merchants sometimes arrived at their destination to discover that goods they were certain they had secured were missing, or lighter than they should have been, or had been substituted. The sophistication of some of these operations was, looking back at it, genuinely impressive, and the counter-strategies developed by experienced merchants were equally sophisticated. Never carry everything in one bag, distribute valuables between different pack animals, sleep with the most critical items against your body, trust the monastery before the inn if you have a choice, Always sleep closest to the door, not farthest from it. The accumulated wisdom of 1,000 safe arrivals and 100 near misses crystallized into habits so automatic they were no longer thought about. Just done. I want to leave you with one image of the mountain night that I find completely beautiful. When travellers slept outdoors, which happened more often than any romanticised account of medieval travel, acknowledges they were sleeping under a sky that none of us alive today has ever truly seen. No light pollution, no orange glow on the horizon from a distant city, no satellites tracking across the dark, just stars, more stars than any modern person has ever looked at unless they have deliberately sought out the most remote and dark places on Earth. And those stars were not decoration. They were navigational instruments. They were a clock. They were for the experienced mountain traveller, a way of reading the night, gauging what time it was, which direction was which, whether the weather was holding or changing. Aristotle had written about how certain peaks were too high for clouds to form above them, and on a still clear night in the Alps, a traveller lying on their back and looking up would have understood something about the relationship between mountain and sky that we've entirely lost in our lit-up indoor climate-controlled world. The mountain at night was not simply dark. It was alive with a different kind of light. And the traveller who understood that light, who could read the stars the way a shepherd reads the grass, was in their own way as navigated as any modern GPS system, just quieter and considerably colder. The morning when it came was its own revelation. The traveller who had made it through the night, who had slept, eaten, confirmed the road conditions, distributed their trust wisely, and their coin carefully rose in the mountain dawn, with something precious in their hands. Information about the animals that had carried them to this point. That story is one I have been saving because the animals of the mountain passes are not an afterthought to this journey. They are the engine of it, the four-legged, stubbornly patient, occasionally catastrophically opinionated engine. And without understanding what it cost an animal to cross these mountains, the weight on its back, the risk beneath its hooves, the particular arithmetic of a mule navigating a ledge path in mist, you cannot fully understand what it cost the humans who depended on them entirely to reach the other side. Land. Somewhere in the mountains of the Alps in the year 373 of the Common Era, someone carved an inscription into the rock beside the road. It was not poetry, it was not a prayer, it was a record of a road construction. But embedded in that inscription, almost as an afterthought, was something that a Roman emperor named Julian had apparently remarked upon the particular dangers of the narrow alpine roads, not just for the people travelling them, but for the draft animals who shared the journey. That detail has stayed with me, because Julian was one of the most powerful men in the world at that moment. He had armies, he had fleets, he had the entire administrative apparatus of the Roman Empire at his disposal, and what he noticed on the mountain road was the mules, the danger to the mules, the debt that everything, all the trade, all the movement, all the connectivity of his world owed to the animals that most people never thought about at all. Let me make a claim that I think is genuinely defensible. The mountain passes of history were built by human decision, maintained by human labour, and crossed by human will. But they were carried by animals. Without the mule, the donkey, the Bactrian camel, the yak, the horse, the mountain pass as a working system of commerce and communication simply does not exist. You can have all the cairns in the world. You can have the most motivated merchant and the most courageous pilgrim. But someone has to physically move the goods over the mountain. And across most of human history, across all the mountain ranges of the world, that someone was not human. It was an animal. And the story of which animals and why and what it cost them, that is a story that the written historical record almost entirely ignores, and that the archaeological record is only now beginning to recover. Start with the mule. Because the mule is, in my opinion, one of the most underappreciated creatures in the entire history of human civilization. The mule is the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. It cannot reproduce itself. Mules are almost universally sterile, a consequence of the mismatched chromosome counts from its two parent species, which means that every mule that ever existed had to be deliberately bred, which means that the existence of mules at any given time was a direct reflection of how much human civilization valued them. And the answer for most of recorded history is enormously. The Hittites, one of the great powers of the ancient Near East people renowned above all else for their mastery of horses and chariotry, considered mules to be worth at least 3 times the value of a good horse. 3 times. The Sumerians priced mules at 7 times the value of a donkey. In medieval Europe, a good mule was often more expensive than an average horse. Why? Because the mule combines the best characteristics of both its parents and discards most of the worst. From the horse, it inherits size, speed, and a certain elegance of movement. From the donkey, it inherits something far more valuable for mountain travel's sure-footedness: patience, the ability to navigate difficult terrain without panic, the intelligence, and this is genuinely documented, not just romantic projection, to refuse to take a step that its instincts tell it is unsafe. A horse on a narrow ledge path above a precipice can spook, can bolt, can make a decision that kills both itself and its handler. A mule on that same ledge will stop. It will assess. It will not be hurried into taking a step it does not trust. This is not stubbornness. This is the most sophisticated form of self-preservation instinct in the entire category of working animals, and on an alpine mountain pass where one wrong step meant a fall, that nothing could survive, that self-preservation instinct was worth more than any amount of human courage or planning. The mule also had another advantage that becomes crucial in mountain contexts. It was cheaper to maintain than a horse, considerably cheaper. Horses require significant amounts of grain, a diet richer than what most mountain paths could naturally provide. Mules can thrive on what the road offers: coarse grass, scrub vegetation, the edges of fields and paths. This meant that a mule caravan could move through terrain where a horse-based operation would struggle simply to feed itself. And in the high passes where there was no grazing to speak of and every ounce of animal feed had to be carried, this difference was the difference between a viable economic enterprise and an impossibly expensive one. The Romans knew this. When General Gaius Marius was reforming the Roman army in the late 2nd century before the Common Era, he insisted that every soldier carry as much of his own equipment as possible, roughly 50 to 60 pounds each specifically, to reduce the army's dependence on pack animals. His soldiers became known with dark military humour as Marius's mules. The joke was not just about the weight they carried. It was a tribute to what the actual mule made possible, but the mule was only one piece of a much larger story. Because the genius of mountain transport across history was not the choice of any single animal. It was the recognition that different terrain required different creatures, and the greatest trading network in human history, the Silk Road, was essentially built on the understanding that the world's mountains were not all the same, and that each demanded its own particular solution. In the deserts of Central Asia, the Bactrian camel reigned, not the single-humped dromedary of the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, though that animal was extraordinary in its own right. The Bactrian camel. 2 humps, 2 coats of hair, a light summer coat, and an astonishingly dense winter coat that could sustain the animal through temperatures as low as -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Calloused feet designed for ice and rock as much as sand. The ability to carry up to 600 pounds of cargo. The ability to travel a week without water. In the mountain passes of the Pamirs and the Karakoram, the ranges that connect China to Central Asia, Among the highest and most brutal mountain environments on Earth, the Bactrian camel was as close to an engineering solution as biology has ever produced. There is an account from a caravan traveller crossing one of the high Silk Road routes through the Pamir Mountains that I find completely visceral. The traveller described a particularly bad stretch of narrow ledge path. His horse slipped and fell to its forelegs. He pulled on the reins and the animal struggled back up. Fear dampened his body, he wrote as they climbed on. And then ahead of him a camel slipped and collapsed. It could not stand. It knelt. And then this is the detail that gets me every time the camel tried to crawl forward. On its knees, on a mountain path, with 600 pounds on its back. The handlers had to risk their own lives to unload it, to redistribute the cargo, to get the animal back on its feet. And then they continued. Because what else do you do? At the highest elevations in Tibet, in the Karakoram in the Himalayas, above the passes where even the hardiest camels struggle for breath, there was the yak. The yak is physiologically one of the most remarkable large mammals on Earth. Its lungs are larger than those of comparably sized lowland cattle. Its heart is proportionally bigger. Its blood carries oxygen with an efficiency that no lowland creature can match. It produces milk at altitude. It provides wool. It provides meat. It provides warmth by proximity on cold nights. And it can carry up to 220 pounds of cargo across mountain passes that sit at 14,000, 15,000, 17,000 feet above sea level, where the air is so thin that most humans can barely walk without gasping. The yak's cloven hooves distribute weight evenly on snow and unstable ground. Its instinct for finding safe footing on ice is uncanny, and unlike almost any other domestic animal, the yak does not need to be managed with the same intensity as a horse, or even a mule. It finds its own path. It chooses its own footing. The handler's job is not to direct the yak so much as to trust the yak, and the mountain communities of the Himalayas understood this implicitly. When the ancient trade routes through Ladakh were at their height from roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era all the way to the 14th century of the Common Era, caravans moving between China, Tibet, India and Central Asia used yaks for the highest sections and exchanged them for horses, donkeys or camels as the altitude decreased and the terrain changed. The animal portfolio managed as carefully as the goods it carried. Now can I tell you the detail about all of this that I think gets overlooked most dramatically? It is the sound. A pack animal on a mountain path makes a very specific kind of noise. Not dramatic noise, not the noise of effort or danger, just the rhythmic constant percussion of hooves on stone or packed earth, multiplied by however many animals are in the train. And in the camel caravans of the Silk Road, which I mentioned earlier but want to return to now, there was something else. In any caravan of 5 to 12 camels roped together head to tail, a bell was tied to the last animal in the line, not for decoration, as an alarm. Because if the caravan leader dozed off on the first camel, which apparently did happen with some regularity, a fact I find both humanizing and slightly alarming, and if suddenly the bell went silent, it meant someone was trying to steal the camel at the back of the line. Silence was the warning. The bell's absence was the alarm. That detail that bells on the last camel with a caravan security system tells you more about how these people lived and worked than a dozen scholarly texts could. They had solved a real problem with an elegant solution, and they had done it by paying close attention to the animals in their care. What I find most moving about the animals in this story is not their endurance, not their carrying capacity, not even the extraordinary adaptations that evolution had given them for environments that would have killed a human in hours. It is the relationship. The handlers who knew their mules by name, who understood which animal would balk at a particular type of surface and needed to be approached from the left rather than the right, Who knew from the angle of a donkey's ears whether the animal was nervous about something ahead on the path, and who trusted that nervousness and slowed down and found often enough that the animal had detected something the human had missed? This working partnership between humans and pack animals, refined over thousands of years of shared mountain experience, was one of the most sophisticated forms of interspecies communication ever developed. Not language, not the theatrical tricks of a circus, just mutual attention, mutual trust. Two creatures who needed each other to survive and who had gradually learned to read each other with a fluency that outsiders could not perceive. And yet, and this is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to sit with, the animals are almost invisible in the written historical record. The mule that carried the silk across the Palmer Mountains is not mentioned by the merchant who profited from its arrival. The camel that crawled on its knees on a mountain ledge in a desperate attempt to keep its load moving forward is noted only because the traveller who witnessed it was observant enough to write it down. The yak bones found in the ice at the Lenbreen Pass in Norway, preserved for 1,000 years by the cold, they are the evidence of an animal that worked and died in service of a trade system that the historical record barely acknowledges them as part of. There is something important in this. A civilization's relationship with its pack animals is, I think, a kind of moral document. The Hittites, who prized a mule at 3 times the value of a horse, were not being sentimental. They were being accurate. They were recognizing in the most concrete terms possible the actual contribution that animal was making to their lives. The medieval historian who failed to mention the mule was not being cruel. He simply did not think of the mule as history. He thought of it as a tool, and I wonder sometimes what future generations will think of the animals in our own lives, the ones whose contributions we take for granted, and whose labour we note only when it fails. The animals were the engine, the humans were the planners, and what the planners had learned over centuries of mountain travel was that the engine needed to be understood, respected, and crucially protected. Because a dead mule on a mountain path was not just a tragedy for the animal, it was a catastrophe for everyone who depended on what it was carrying. It was the loss of the season's revenue, the delay of an embassy, the failure of a pilgrimage. The entire system, so carefully constructed, so painstakingly maintained, it all rested ultimately on 4 hooves and a sure step, and the willingness of an animal to go where a human needed it to go. And those humans who didn't make it, the ones whose careful planning and trusted animals and hard-won knowledge were not in the end enough, the ones who set out over the mountain and simply never arrived. Their story, what we know of it, and what the mountains have finally begun to release after centuries of silence, is something I have been holding back for exactly this moment. Because the story of those who died in the passes tells us something about the cost of all of this, that no amount of successful crossings can fully account for. And the way we are learning it through the slow melt of ancient ice, through objects reappearing after centuries of preservation, is one of the most haunting and beautiful chapters in all of modern archaeology. September the 19th, 1991. 2 German hikers are walking through the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy, at an altitude of roughly 3,200 meters above sea level. They see something in the ice. It looks at first like a recent mountaineering accident. A body partially exposed by the melting edge of a glacier. They report it to the authorities, and then the dating begins. And the world discovers that what these 2 hikers stumbled across was not a recent victim at all. It was a man who had died on that mountain pass 5,300 years ago. 5,300 years. His last meal, dried ibex meat, deer, einkorn wheat, was still in his stomach. His copper-bladed axe was still beside him. His unfinished bow lay nearby. And in his left shoulder, invisible until a computed tomography scan revealed it 10 years after his discovery, was a flint arrowhead. Someone had shot him from behind. His subclavian artery was torn. He bled to death within minutes alone on a high alpine pass in the late Neolithic period more than 2,000 years before the first Roman road was built. And the ice took him and held him for 53 centuries. Ötzi the Iceman, as he came to be known, named after the valley where he was found, is the most famous of the mountain pass dead. But he is far from the only one, and as the glaciers and ice patches of the world's mountain ranges continue their retreat, under the warming climate of our era, the dead are coming back, slowly, one object at a time, one body at a time, returning to us from centuries or millennia of cold storage, carrying their stories and their bones and their belongings. And what those stories tell us about the cost of mountain travel, about the human lives spent crossing these passes, about what it meant to set out over the mountain and not arrive on the other side, is something that no historical document could have prepared us for. In the summer of 2003, the kind of summer that Europeans still refer to with a kind of quiet dread, a heat wave that killed tens of thousands of people across the continent, an ice field on a pass in the Swiss Alps called Schneedejoch began to melt at a pace that had not been seen in living memory. And as it melted, objects began to appear. A Swiss hiker found the first one a piece of birch bark that looked unusual. She took it home. She showed it to the Historical Museum of Bern, and they understood immediately that something extraordinary had been preserved in that ice. In the years that followed, archaeologists recovered more than 900 artifacts from the Schneedejoch Pass and its surrounding ice field. 900 leather remnants of shoes and leggings, a bow 162 centimeters long made of yew wood, arrow shafts, arrowheads, a birch bark case carefully made for carrying the bow, bronze needles, belt fragments of woven grass and bark, over 100 shoe nails from the Roman period, fragments of a leather shoe from the 8th or 9th century of the Common Era, a shoe repair kit from the 14th or 15th century, more than 70 radiocarbon dates confirming that the Schneedejoch Pass had been in continuous use as a mountain crossing since at least 4,800 years before the Common Era. That is nearly 7,000 years of human traffic, 7,000 years of people crossing this one pass heading from the Bernese Oberland to the Rhone Valley, carrying what they needed and sometimes losing what they carried. And what they lost is now speaking to us from the ice. But here is the detail from Schneedejoch that I cannot let go of. The bow kit, complete, the yew wood bow, the birch bark case, the arrow shafts, everything a hunter or traveller would need, found together, all of it, but no body, no remains, not a bone, not a tooth, nothing human, just the equipment. The archaeologist Albert Hafner, who led the investigation of Schneedejoch, said simply, "We think this person had an accident, but there has been no trace of the person up to now. An accident. Someone crossed this pass carrying a complete hunting kit, and somewhere on that slope something went wrong, and the ice took the equipment, but not the person. Or perhaps it took the person to somewhere else somewhere the melt has not yet reached. Perhaps they are still there, waiting." What the glacial archaeology of mountain passes is teaching us, and this is still an evolving field, still gathering pace, still generating discoveries, is that the passes were not just routes, they were archives. Every traveller who crossed a mountain pass left something of themselves behind, sometimes deliberately a cairn, a prayer, an offering, sometimes accidentally a dropped tool, a lost piece of clothing, an arrow that missed its mark and sank into the snow, and sometimes in the most final and irreversible way possible they left themselves, their bodies, their bones, their belongings scattered around them in the moment that the mountain claimed them. The ice, unlike the earth, does not decompose what it contains. It holds things in the exact condition they were in when the cold took them. A leather legging from the Neolithic period found at Schniedejoch was still recognisable as a legging, still showed the stitching, still showed the cut of the hide, still showed in its construction the craft traditions of a person who had lived and worked and probably died before the first Egyptian pyramid was built. That legging was sitting in the ice perfectly preserved for 6,000 years, and then a warm summer came, and it appeared. I want to spend a moment with Yotzi specifically because his story contains within it almost every dimension of mountain pass travel that we've been exploring in this journey together. He was, by the evidence of his possessions, a man of some status. His copper axe, alone at a time when copper tools were valuable and not widely owned, marks him as more than an ordinary traveller. His clothing was sophisticated. His coat was stitched together from the hides of at least 4 different animals, ibex, chamois deer, and a domestic goat. His shoes were carefully constructed leather outer soles, a deer hide upper grass stuffed inside for insulation. His final meal was substantial and well-planned dried meat from 2 different wild animals, along with grain and einkorn wheat. He was not a desperate person scrambling across the mountain on inadequate preparation. He was by every material measure available to us a competent and experienced mountain traveller. And someone shot him in the back anyway. On the day he died, his right hand showed a deep, fresh wound between his thumb and forefinger. A defensive wound, the kind sustained in hand-to-hand confrontation, meaning that in the days before his death he'd been in a fight. He had survived that fight. He had climbed the mountain. He had sat down at the pass, possibly to rest, possibly to tend his wound, and someone followed him, and from below and from behind shot him with a bow, and removed the arrow shaft afterward. Only the arrowhead stayed in his shoulder, caught in the wound. The oldest murder case in human history, and the murderer was never caught, and they have been at large for 5,300 years. There is a different kind of death in the passes that I want to talk about as well. Not violence, accident. The slip that sent a foot off an icy ledge. The avalanche that arrived without warning. The cold that crept in as exhaustion reduced a person's ability to generate heat, and then stopped them from understanding that they were in danger. These deaths are harder to recover from the ice because they often left less behind. A person who fell into a crevasse might leave nothing that the surface ever returned. A person buried by an avalanche might leave artifacts scattered across a wide debris field, disarticulated and separated from any human remains by the violence of the event. But some of them do come back. At the Lenbreen Pass in Norway, where the ice has been releasing its collection over the past decade, archaeologists found a broken walking stick with a runic inscription. Those words owned by Joar that I mentioned right at the beginning of our journey together. Joar dropped that stick, or Joar fell, or the storm came. And now, 1,000 years later, we hold the stick and read the name, and we know that Joar was here. At Schniedejoch, the finds span not just 6,000 years, but the gaps between them. The archaeologists noticed something remarkable in the distribution of the radiocarbon dates. The artifacts clustered in specific periods: Neolithic, Early Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Roman Early Medieval. And between those clusters there were gaps, long gaps, silences of centuries, and those silences correspond, when matched against climate records, to periods when the glaciers on the Schniedejoch were advancing, when the ice was growing rather than retreating, making the pass impassable. The artifacts themselves were telling a climate history. When the glacier advanced, the traffic stopped. When it retreated, the traffic resumed, and the things people dropped or lost on that route recorded with the precision of radiocarbon dating exactly when the mountain was open and when it was closed. The pass as a climate archive. The dead and their belongings as evidence of warming and cooling that no instrument recorded. Only the ice. There is something deeply strange about living in an era when this is happening. when the glaciers that held these objects for thousands of years are retreating fast enough that a generation of archaeologists has had to create an entirely new discipline, glacial archaeology, simply to keep pace with what the melting is revealing. Every summer now, somewhere in the Alps or the Himalayas or the mountains of Scandinavia or the ice patches of Mongolia or Alaska, something new appears, something that was lost, something that was dropped or hidden or left behind when a person did not make it home. And the archaeologists who work these sites know that they have a narrow window. Objects that emerge from ice are preserved perfectly. But once exposed to air and light and temperature fluctuation, they begin to degrade rapidly. A leather artifact that survived 5,000 years in the ice might deteriorate beyond recovery in a single summer if nobody finds it in time. The archaeologist Lars Pillow, who has spent years working the Lenbreen site in Norway, described it as a race against time and against the warmth that is simultaneously revealing the past and destroying it. The melting ice is like a library that is being slowly consumed by fire. Every day new books appear. Every day some of them burn before anyone can read them. What I take away from all of this is not simply sadness, though there is sadness in it certainly. The people who died in these passes were real. They had names, or most of them did. Yor had a name. Ötzi had a name, though we will never know it. The person who carried that Neolithic bow kit across the Schneederjoch and did not make it to the other side had a name and a family and a village somewhere in the valleys below that probably waited for them. That waiting is the part that history cannot record and the ice cannot preserve. The grief of the people who watched someone leave and did not see them return. But alongside the sadness, I want you to notice something else. Something that I find extraordinary and ultimately hopeful. These passes were used endlessly, repeatedly, for thousands of years, knowing the risk, knowing that the mountain took people, knowing that conditions could change, that the path could fail, that the cold was not forgiving. And they went anyway, not recklessly, but deliberately, because what was on the other side mattered, because the connection between one valley and the next mattered, because trade and pilgrimage and communication and the movement of ideas and cultures and languages across these stone barriers mattered enough to justify the cost. The dead in the passes are not evidence that mountain travel was foolish. They are evidence that it was important enough to continue despite everything it cost. And the world we live in today, with its trade networks and its cultural exchanges and its religions that spread across mountain ranges and its languages that blended wherever people met at high passes, that world was built in part on the willingness of ordinary people to walk into the mountain and risk not coming back. The ones who never made it home are part of that world too. Their journeys did not reach the other side. But their story held in the ice for centuries has. And speaking of stories that finally reach their destination, there is one more thing I want to talk about before we bring this whole journey to its close, because we have spent all of this time talking about what the mountain passes cost, the danger, the cold, the bandits, the invisible killers, the ones who did not survive. But I want to end somewhere different. I want to end with what the passes gave, what they built. The world that exists because people crossed the mountains, the trade routes, the spread of religions, the blending of cultures, the roads that became the borders of nations, the connections that still shape how we live today. Because the legacy of the mountain pass is not only written in the deaths, it is written in everything that crossed, and that legacy is enormous. And it is right here, all around us, in the world we inherited from the people who dared the mountain and made it through. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Switzerland has 4 official languages, German, French, Italian and Romansh. 4, in a country smaller than the state of West Virginia. Why? Because the Alpine passes determined which valleys connected to which lowlands, and which lowlands spoke which language. and which cultural traditions French, Italian or German flowed through, which gaps in the mountains to settle in which valleys over centuries of commerce and migration. The linguistic map of Switzerland is in its most fundamental architecture a map of mountain pass geography. The passes did not just connect the world, they drew the boundaries of languages, of identities, of what it meant and still means to be from one valley versus another. The mountain carved the human. We began this journey a long time ago up at the top of a pass in the wind with a lost traveller looking for a path through the snow, and in the hours since then we've walked through so much. We have watched kings decide the fate of empires based on which gap in the mountain would let their armies through. We have followed merchants calculating the cost of every toll and the weight of every load. We have listened to pilgrims pray their way over ice and rock towards something they believed was worth any price the mountain asked. We have met the monks who spent their whole lives at the summit, keeping a door open for strangers. We've heard the bells on the last camel in the line. We've crouched in the darkness of a medieval inn, listening to strangers breathe on the other side of a shared room. We have found a name carved into a walking stick. We have held a boot that was lost 5,000 years ago. We have stood at the edge of what the ice is releasing and understood that the mountain has been keeping things for us, and is only now beginning to give them back. What is the legacy of all of this? Let me try to answer that as honestly as I can. The most obvious legacy is economic. Buddhism, which spread from India into Central Asia and China, and eventually across much of East Asia, travelled through mountain passes, specifically through the passes of the Khyber and the Pamirs carried by merchants who moved with their goods and brought their beliefs with them. The spread of Islam into Central Asia in the 8th century moved along mountain trade routes. Christianity reached the distant regions of the Roman Empire partly along the road networks that threaded through the Alpine passes. Paper-making technology, which originated in China and eventually transformed literacy and communication across the Western world, spread westward through mountain corridors. Glass-making knowledge went east. Agricultural techniques crossed mountain ranges in both directions. The spices that defined European medieval cuisine, the pepper, the cinnamon, the cloves, passed through mountain passes on their way from their origins to European tables. The silk that made fortunes in Roman markets crossed mountains in the packs of traders who never saw either the looms that produced it or the people who ultimately wore it. These are not abstract historical forces. They are the reason that the world you live in today looks the way it does. The reason you have access to the cultural and intellectual traditions of multiple civilizations simultaneously. The reason that ideas from India sit comfortably beside ideas from Greece in the philosophical foundations of the world you inherited. The passes did that. The people who crossed them did that. The second legacy is architectural, and I use that word in its broader sense. The towns that grew up at the feet of the Alpine passes Bolzano, Aosta, Martigny, Innsbruck exist because of the passes. The cities that grew wealthy as staging posts on the approaches to the great mountain crossings shaped the political map of medieval Europe. Venice became Venice in part because of its position at the southern end of the Alpine trade routes. The merchant families who controlled the passes, who invested in roads, in hospices, in toll collection systems, built fortunes that funded the Renaissance, literally. Some of the art and architecture that defines Western culture today was paid for by the profits of Alpine trade. The man who funded Brunelleschi's dome in Florence was a Medici banker, and the Medici banking empire was built in significant part on the profits of commerce that flowed through and around the mountain passes of Europe. The mountain funded the cathedral. The third legacy is territorial. The borders of European nations were drawn in many cases by the watersheds of mountain ranges. The dividing line that sent the waters of the Alps north toward the Rhine or south toward the Po also sent the political allegiance of the valleys along those rivers in different directions. After the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, the new borders of European nations were drawn partly along alpine ridgelines. The Brenner Pass became an international border between Austria and Italy, a status it retains today. The mountain pass that had been a connection for centuries became a boundary, and in that transition from connector to divider, you can read the entire arc of the 20th century's relationship with national identity and territorial sovereignty. The same gap in the rock, the same wind, a different meaning. But the legacy I find most compelling is the quietest one. It is the legacy of the human instinct to connect. When I look at what the mountain passes actually were, when I strip away the romance and the drama, and look at the bare historical fact, what I see is this people living on one side of an enormous natural barrier, consistently, persistently, across thousands of years and dozens of generations, found ways to reach the people on the other side. Not because it was easy. It was never easy. Not because it was safe. It was rarely fully safe. But because something in human beings, something fundamental, something that may be as basic to us as shelter and food, requires connection. Requires knowing what is on the other side. Requires trading not just goods, but ideas and stories and ways of understanding the world. The mountain said, "You cannot cross me," and the human said, "Watch," and they crossed again, and they built cairns so the next person could cross, and they built hospices so the next person would survive, and they bred dogs that could find the buried and the lost, and they created songs and prayers and rituals for the crossing, and they carved names into walking sticks, and they wrote letters home, and they dropped things in the ice that are only now coming back to us, speaking across millennia, in a language made of leather and wood and bone. I want to ask you something before we part for tonight. You've been on a long journey with me, a journey measured not in miles but in centuries, from the first human footprints on an alpine pass 6,000 years ago, all the way to the archaeologist crouching on a melting ice field in 2003, picking up a piece of birch bark that had been waiting for 5,000 years. And my question is simply this: do you still think of mountains as walls? Because I don't. Not anymore. When I think of a mountain range now, I think of it the way the people who actually had to cross these passes thought of it. Not as a barrier, as a question. A standing question asked by the geography itself is, what is on the other side worth what this crossing costs? And the answer that human beings have given across all of recorded history is this: yes, emphatically, sometimes recklessly, often at enormous personal cost, but yes. The answer is yes. And because they kept saying yes, because they kept crossing and dying and building and trying again, the world we live in today is as connected as it is, as rich with borrowed ideas and blended cultures and shared languages and layered faiths as it is, as large as it is. The mountain passes are the reason. The people who crossed them are the reason. And Joar with a walking stick, whose name was the last thing I wanted to remember tonight, Joar, who crossed that Norwegian mountain 1,000 years ago and dropped a stick in the snow, is in some small way the reason too, because Joar went. And that willingness to go across the cold, through the dark, over the mountain, is the most human thing there is. So tonight, wherever you're lying down to rest in whatever comfortable warmth you have, that the people in this story spent their lives trying to reach, take a breath, and think about the crossing, your crossing, whatever mountain it is that stands in front of you right now, not the Alps, not the Khyber, your mountain, the thing that seems impossibly large and cold and dangerous between where you are and where you need to be. And remember that the people who carved cairns out of nothing but stones and determination, who kept a fire burning at 8,000 feet so a stranger could get warm, who followed a dog through a blizzard towards someone they had never met, Those people did not have more courage than you have. They just kept going, one step and then another, and the world was built from those steps. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey tonight. For every hour of this story, for every moment you stayed with me, through the passes and the storms and the hospices and the ice, I am genuinely grateful. I hope it carried you somewhere peaceful. I hope it settled something in you. I hope the world feels a little larger and a little more connected than it did when we started. If this story found you somewhere that mattered in bed with the lights off or on a quiet night when you needed to go somewhere else for a while, please leave a comment below and tell me where you were. I read them. Everyone. And if you enjoyed the journey, a like and a subscribe means everything. It is what keeps these stories coming. Because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about the people who lived in the hidden corners of history that the textbook skipped over. Stories about the ordinary lives that shaped the extraordinary world. I am already working on the next one, and I genuinely think it might be the best one yet. Stay close, sleep well, and I will see you on the other side.